The cold kiss of the axe was the last thing Rhaegar ever expected. He had served the divine order for decades. He had bled for the temples, killed for the priests, and offered every victory in his life at the altar of the kings who now watched him die. The execution block was rough against his throat. The crowd, the same people he had saved countless times, screamed for his blood. And standing on the platform, her robes pristine and her eyes empty, was Archmage Lyanna, the woman he had trusted with his life, the woman who had placed the letter of treason in his quarters herself. The blade fell, and Rhaegar screamed, but the scream did not come from a severed throat. It came from his lung. His eyes shot open and he gasped like a man drowning, his hand flying to his neck. The skin was smooth, unbroken. He was lying on a cold stone floor, the kind found in the barracks of the Celestial Hero Academy. The smell was unmistakable: cheap tallow candle, steel polish, and the sweat of 100 anxious cadets. "No," he whispered, his voice hoarse and young. He looked at his hands. They were not the scarred, calloused hands of the 30-year-old assassin who had been executed. These were the hands of a boy, smooth, untrained. A boot kicked him in the ribs. Move, failure. The blessing ceremony doesn't wait for dead weight. Rhaegar rolled with the blow, his assassin instincts taking over immediately. Even in this strange, weak body, the muscle memory remained. He looked up at the cadet who had kicked him, a young noble with a sneer that Rhaegar remembered from his first life. The world came crashing back. The year, the place. He was at the academy, 20 years before his death, before the betrayal, before the kings revealed their true, rotten nature. He stumbled to his feet, joining the line of cadets shuffling into the grand cathedral of the academy. His mind was a storm. He had been given a second chance. Why? He wasn't a holy man. He was a killer, a tool. As he walked through the massive stone archways, the stained glass windows depicting the Pantheon of light loomed over him. In his past life, these images had filled him with reverence. Now they filled him with a cold, quiet hatred. He remembered the apathy in the eyes of the priests as they read his sentence. He remembered the silence from the heavens as the axe fell. The cadets stood in a long line, waiting to approach the altar of blessing. A massive floating orb of pure energy sat atop it, pulsing with a soft light. This was the moment that defined a person's life. The orb would scan a soul and grant a divine blessing. The stronger the blessing, the higher the social status. Fire, light, strength, healing. These were the marks of the chosen. Rhaegar watched as the cadet ahead of him, a nervous boy from the outer cities, placed his hand on the orb. It flared bright orange, and a priest announced, "Blessing of the Forge, B-tier." The boy wept with joy. He would be a blacksmith for the hero, a good life. Then a cold silence fell over the crowd. Prince Kael stepped forward. Even as a youth, his presence was immense. Blonde hair, eyes like molten gold, and the arrogance of a man who had never been told no. He placed his hand on the orb. The entire cathedral shook. Light exploded from the orb, blinding the priests. A pillar of white fire shot through the roof, parting the clouds. The lead priest stumbled backward, his voice trembling with awe. "Ethereal blessing, the light of judgment, S-rank. A future king of the Pantheon walks among us." Rhaegar watched Kael, and a memory of cold steel flashed through his mind. It was Kael who had led the execution squad. It was Kael's blade that had been raised to signal the Axeman, the perfect prince, the loyal dog of the king. Rhaegar's fists clenched, but his face remained a mask of blank obedience. Not yet. He couldn't act yet. Finally, his name was called. Cadet Rhaegar. He walked forward. The crowd of nobles and highborn cadets sneered at his common clothes. He placed his hand on the orb. For a moment nothing happened. Then the orb flickered. The bright light inside it dimmed, turning a murky, sickly gray. It looked like smoke was filling a glass jar. The priests exchanged confused glances. The orb pulsed once, weakly, and then a single, thin beam of shadow leaked out, barely visible, before the light extinguished entirely. The cathedral was dead silent. Then the laughter started. "A shadow, he got a shadow. That's not even a blessing, that's a curse." The lead priest looked at his tablet, his face wrinkled with disgust. "Blessing, designated, shade, rank unclassified, effect, none detected." He looked at Rhaegar as if he were a piece of garbage. "You are relegated to the remedial class. Report to Barracks 7. Next." Rhaegar bowed his head, hiding the smile that threatened to crack his lips. A blessing that did nothing. In his past life, he had been given the blessing of the hawk, a high-tier perception ability. But now, Nothing. It was perfect. He would be invisible. The nobles would ignore him. The priests would forget him. He could move through the shadows of the academy without anyone watching. As he turned to leave, a flash of light appeared before his eyes. It was unlike the divine light of the cathedral. This was a deep, bloody crimson. A holographic window materialized in his vision, something that had never existed in his past life. System activation, DATACTAD. Host, Rhaegar, status, reborn. Synchronization, 100%. The Scarlet Star system is now online. Rhaegar froze in the middle of the mocking crowd. No one else could see it. The window flickered and changed. Primary quest. Title, The First Slaughter. Objective, assassinate the source of divine power. Status, incomplete. Rhaegar's blood ran cold. The source of divine power. The king. His mission, his very purpose for being dragged back into this world, was laid out in cold, clinical text. He was not here to redeem himself. He was not here to live a quiet life. He was here to finish what the kings had started when they condemned an innocent man. He looked back at the altar, at the priests, at Prince Kael, who was basking in the adoration of the crowd. They were all pawns, worshippers of a corrupt system. And Rhaegar, the failure, the shade, the boy with no blessing, had just been handed the only weapon that mattered, the truth. He walked out of the cathedral and into the cold academy air. The other failures, the sick, the weak, the cursed, were gathered outside, waiting to be marched to their barracks. They looked at him with pity. He looked at the sky, at the distant clouds where the divine realm supposedly floated, and a single thought crossed his mind. I'm coming for you. Chapter 2. The Worthless Blessing of Shadows. The days that followed were a lesson in humility and strategy. The remedial class was a dumping ground. The academy didn't expect them to become heroes, it expected them to die. They were given the worst food, the oldest equipment, and the most dangerous chores. Rhaegar embraced it. He ate the stale bread. He wore the rusted armor. He listened. He listened to the gossip of the servant. He mapped the patrol routes of the guard. He noted the schedules of the instructor. He was building a picture of the academy, not as a student, but as an assassin casing a target. One night, lying in his bunk, listening to a sickly boy cough himself to sleep, the system activated. A new window appeared. Side quest available. Title, The Hunger of the Divine. Location, Village of Ashford Academy Territory. Objective, investigate the disappearance of villager. Warning, divine energy fluctuation detected. Rhaegar's eyes narrowed. A divine energy fluctuation near the academy. That was impossible. The academy was protected by a barrier TH, a T Chinese letter ED, divine interference to keep the students safe during training. If there was a leak, it meant one thing. A king, or an avatar of a king, was actively feeding on the mortals nearby. He thought of the system's primary quest. Kill the king. He was one man trapped in a weak body surrounded by enemies. He needed power. He needed to know if this system was, if he could actually harm a divine being. The next day, the remedial class was assigned to latrine duty near the western wall. It was disgusting, backbreaking work, but it was also the closest Rhaegar had been to the exit. As the others complained and worked slowly, Rhaegar slipped away. He moved like a ghost, using the shadows of the wall to cover his movement. The guards patrolling the perimeter never saw him. His useless shade blessing seemed to make him slippery. The guard's eyes simply slid past where he stood. He climbed the wall and dropped down the other side, free. The village of Ashford was a half-day's walk. As he approached, the cheerful rural life he expected was absent. The village was silent. The doors were barred. An old man sat on a well, staring at nothing. Rhaegar approached him. The disappearances, Rhaegar said. Where did they happen? The old man flinched. The forest, the old temple in the forest. The young ones go in to pray for a blessing and they never come out, but we hear them, at night, screaming. Rhaegar nodded. He didn't need to hear more. A temple in the woods that consumed the faithful. It was a parasitic shrine. A minor king, too weak to have a proper domain, leeching life force from desperate peasants. It was pathetic, and it was exactly the kind of target he needed. He waited until nightfall. The forest was dark, but his eyes adapted instantly. The shade blessing, useless they called it, allowed him to see in pure blackness as if it were twilight. He found the temple, a crumbling stone structure covered in glowing moss. The air hummed with a sickly sweet pressure, divine energy. He pushed open the rotting door. Inside, the temple was pristine. Golden light filled the hall, and at the altar stood a figure. It looked like a beautiful man carved from marble, but its eyes were hungry voids. It held the limp body of a young girl, drinking a glowing mist from her mouth. "A worshipper comes at last," the kingling said, its voice like chiming bells. "Kneel, child, and offer me your faith." Rhaegar didn't kneel. He drew a rusted dagger from his belt, the only weapon he could steal. The kingling laughed, a sound of genuine amusement. "A rusted blade, against a king. You are either mad or a fool." Rhaegar looked at the girl, her face pale and sunken. He looked at the king, its marble skin perfect and untouchable. He felt the cold hate in his heart, the memory of the axe, the betrayal, the laughter in the cathedral. "Neither," Rhaegar whispered. "I'm your executioner." He lunged. The kingling flicked a wrist, expecting to blast the mortal into dust. But Rhaegar moved. It wasn't just speed. It was as if he bent the light around him. The shade blessing activated, and for a split second he simply wasn't there. He appeared inside the king's guard, the rusted dagger plunging toward its chest. The blade shattered against divine skin. The kingling snarled, grabbing Rhaegar by the throat. "Fool, you cannot kill a king with mortal steel." Rhaegar choked, his feet dangling off the ground. The king's grip was like iron, squeezing the life out of him. But as his vision dimmed, the system screamed to life. "Critical condition, DATACTAD. Host life force at 5%. Unlocking emergency protocol. Kingslayer arts." A torrent of information flooded Rhaegar's brain. Techniques that shouldn't exist. Knowledge of divine anatomy. The location of the soul core within a king's body. His eyes snapped open, and they were no longer the eyes of a cadet. They were the eyes of the Scarlet Star. He raised his hand, and the shattered hilt of the dagger in his palm glowed black. He didn't stab the chest. He moved his hand through it, reaching past the flesh, past the divine barrier, and grabbing the core of the king's existence. The kingling's eyes widened in pure primal terror. What are you? That's impossible." Rhaegar squeezed. The kingling exploded into a shower of golden light and silent scream. The temple crumbled. The divine pressure vanished. Rhaegar fell to the ground, gasping, his hands smoking. The girl lay nearby, still alive, her breathing steadying now that the parasite was gone. Rhaegar looked at his hand. It was normal, but he knew it would never truly clean again. He had just taken his first step on a path that would lead to war with the heavens. The system chimed, a cheerful, horrific sound. "Quest complete. The hunger of the divine. Reward 5,000 Slayer essence. Skill unlocked. Step of the Forgotten Shadow. Primary quest updated 1. King slain." Rhaegar looked up at the night sky, at the distant, glittering stars that were the domains of the true kings. He had killed a kingling, a pathetic, minor thing, but it proved one undeniable truth. The kings could bleed, and Rhaegar, the failure, the shade, the boy with no blessing, had just learned how to make them die. Chapter 3. The Dungeon's Hidden Truth. The walk back to the academy was a journey through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. Rhaegar's feet moved on their own, carrying him through the dark forest while his mind remained trapped in that crumbling temple, his hands still phantom-feeling the sensation of crushing a king's soul. The girl he had saved would wake in the morning with no memory of what happened, only a vague sense that she had been touched by something terrible and wonderful. The villagers would find the temple collapsed, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, and they would credit their local priest or a passing hero. They would never know that a boy from the remedial class, a failure marked by the curse of the shade, had committed the first murder of the divine in over 1,000 years. Dawn was breaking when Rhaegar reached the academy wall. The guards were changing shifts, their attention focused on the incoming relief, their backs turned to the exact spot he had climbed down hours ago. He moved without thought, his body knowing the angle, the timing, the precise moment to slip through the gap between one guard's yawn and another's stretch. He dropped into the yard and melted into the shadows of the barracks just as the morning bell rang. The remedial class was already assembled for roll call, their faces pale with fear. They had noticed he was missing. The instructor, a fat man named Boren who had failed out of the hero track years ago, was counting heads with a piece of bread in his hand, not caring enough to actually verify the number. "All present," Boren mumbled through a mouthful of crumbs. "Latrine duty. West wall, move." Rhaegar slipped into the back of the line, falling into step beside a sickly boy named Timoth who had the coughing sickness. a disease that slowly filled the lungs with divine-resistant phlegm. Timoth looked at him with watery eyes. "You were gone," Timoth whispered. "I didn't tell, but I saw your bed empty." Rhaegar glanced at the boy. In his past life he had never spoken to the remedial students. They were beneath him, destined to die young and forgotten. But now, looking at Timoth's frightened face, he saw a useful tool: information, loyalty, things that cost nothing to cultivate. "I couldn't sleep," Rhaegar said quietly. "Walked the grounds, got lost." Timoth nodded, accepting the lie because he wanted to believe. "You should be careful. The night patrols, they hurt failures for fun. Last week they caught a boy from our class near the kitchens and broke his fingers so he couldn't hold a mop." Rhaegar filed that information away. The patrols were brutal. The instructors were corrupt. The system was designed to crush the weak and elevate the strong, regardless of morality. It was the same rot he had seen in the divine realm, just scaled down to fit a mortal institution. Latrine duty was exactly as disgusting as it sounded. The academy processed the waste of thousands of students, and the remedial class was responsible for shoveling it into carts and hauling it to the composting pits outside the walls. The other students complained, wept, and vomited. Rhaegar worked in silence, his mind elsewhere. The system had given him a reward: 5,000 Slayer essence. He didn't know what that meant yet, but the skill he had unlocked, Step of the Forgotten Shadow, was already integrated into his muscle memory. It was the reason he had moved so strangely in the temple, the reason the guards hadn't seen him. It wasn't invisibility. It was more like irrelevance. He existed so lightly in the perception of others that their minds simply didn't bother processing his presence. He tested it now as he worked. A group of Chinese letter students walked past, covering their noses and sneering at the remedial filth. Rhaegar stepped slightly to the side, into a patch of shadow cast by a wall, and focused on the skill. He felt a coolness wash over him, like stepping into deep water. The lead student's eyes swept past where he stood without stopping. They saw Timoth, they saw the others, but Rhaegar was simply not there. Useful, he thought, very useful. That night, exhausted and sore, the remedial class collapsed into their bunks in Barracks 7. The building was a converted storage shed at the edge of the academy ground, far from the glorious dormitories of the noble students. The roof leaked. The wind howled through cracks in the walls, but it was private. No instructors came here. No patrols bothered. They were forgotten, which was exactly what Rhaegar wanted. He waited until the others were asleep, their breathing ragged and uneven from various illnesses and injury. Then he sat up and focused on the system. Scarlet Star System. Host Rhaegar. Essence 5,000. Skills: Kingslayer Arts passive sealed. Step of the Forgotten Shadow active. Quests primary ongoing. Side complete. He studied the interface, looking for a store, a skill tree, anything that would let him use the essence he had earned. As if sensing his intent, the system flickered and a new window appeared. Essence Shop. Available purchases. Temporary power: 1 hour Kingslayer Arts unseal 1,000 essence. Permanent skill: Shadow Weave 3,000 essence. Information: Divine Weakness Database 2,000 essence per king. Enhancement: Physical Attribute Boost 500 essence per point. Rhaegar's eyes moved over the options, calculate. The temporary unseal was tempting. He had felt the raw power of the Kingslayer Arts when the system unlocked them in the temple, and having that strength for even an hour could mean the difference between life and death. But it was temporary, a crutch. He needed permanent growth. Shadow Weave, 3,000 essence, a permanent skill. He didn't know what it did, but the name suggested control over shadows, an extension of his shade blessing. If he was going to hunt kings, he needed to master his gifts, not rely on emergency unlocks. He purchased it. Skill acquired: Shadow Weave. Description: Manipulate existing shadows into physical forms, create weapons, barriers, or constructs. Effectiveness scales with ambient darkness. Rhaegar held out his hand and focused on the shadow cast by his own body in the dim moonlight. The shadow rippled, then stretched, extending upward like a thread of black silk. He concentrated, and the thread thickened, forming the shape of a dagger. He reached out and touched it. It was solid, cold, sharp. A smile touched his lips for the first time since his execution. He had a weapon now, a real weapon, one that couldn't be taken away, couldn't be seen by the eyes of the faithful, and wouldn't shatter against divine skin like the rusted dagger had. He dismissed the shadow blade and lay back down, his mind racing with possibility. The system was real, the power was real, and the kings, for all their grandeur, were just targets waiting to be eliminated. Chapter 4. The Archmage's Suspicion. The days turned into weeks. Rhaegar mastered shadow weave in secret, practicing only in the deepest darkness of the barracks at night. He could now form not just daggers, but swords, whips, and even simple barriers that could block attacks. The skill was limited by the available light. In bright sunshine, his shadows were weak and thin, barely enough for a small blade. But at night, or in the unlit corridors beneath the academy, he was becoming something dangerous. He also watched, always watched. He mapped the academy in his mind, noting the patrol patterns of the Inquisition agents who lurked in the shadow, the schedules of the instructor, the secret meetings of the noble students who plotted against each other. He learned that Prince Kael was being groomed for something greater than mere heroism. The priests visited him weekly, taking him to the cathedral for private sessions that lasted hours. They were preparing him for ascension, molding him into a vessel worthy of hosting a divine avatar. And he watched Archmage Lyanna. She was younger now, 20 years removed from the cold-eyed woman who had betrayed him, but the cruelty was already there, hiding beneath a mask of academic perfection. She taught the advanced classes on divine theory, and Rhaegar made it a point to eavesdrop on her lectures whenever possible. He hid in the shadows of the lecture hall, his step active, listening to her explain the nature of the kings with the reverence of a true believer. The divine realm exists on a higher plane of existence, she lectured, her voice melodic and hypnotic. The kings are not merely powerful mortals, they are concepts made flesh. The king of war is war itself. The king of wisdom is wisdom. To strike a king is to strike at the very foundation of reality. This is why heroes who challenge the divine always fail. You cannot kill an idea. You can if you find the right knife. Rhaegar thought from his shadowy corner. After the lecture, the students filed out and Lyanna remained at her desk, grabbing papers. Rhaegar hesitated. She was alone, unaware. He could end her now, remove the woman who would one day frame him for treason and change the future forever. His hand twitched, shadows pooling in his palm. But he stopped. If he killed her now, the Inquisition would investigate. They would find traces of shadow magic, connect it to the dead kindling in the forest, and realize a heretic was operating within the academy. He wasn't ready for that confrontation. And besides, killing Lyanna now would be a mercy. She hadn't committed her crimes yet. In this timeline, she was still innocent. Innocent, he thought bitterly, for now. He let the shadows dissolve and slipped away. Chapter 5. The Kingkiller's First Contract. The first sign that something had changed came during a mandatory training exercise. The remedial class was forced to participate in a dungeon crawl through a controlled dungeon beneath the academy, a series of caves filled with monsters that were supposedly low-level enough for failures to handle. In reality, it was a culling. The academy didn't want to waste resources on students who would never become heroes, so they let the monsters do their work for them. 30 students from the remedial class were herded into the dungeon entrance. Timoth was among them, his cough worse than ever. A girl named Alara who had the blindness curse, unable to see but gifted with prophetic dream. A boy named Vance whose bones were brittle, breaking if he ran too fast. The rejects. The forgotten. The instructor at the entrance, a scarred man named Commander Vex who had lost his arm to a demon years ago, looked at them with open disgust. The dungeon has 3 floors. Reach the bottom, touch the altar, and you pass. Fail, and you die. The doors open in 3 days. Don't be late. He slammed the iron gate shut behind them. The darkness was absolute. The others huddled together, terrified. But for Rhaegar, the darkness was home. His shade blessing drank it in, and his vision sharpened until he could see every detail of the cave around them. The walls were slick with moisture. The air smelled of rot and old blood. And in the distance, something growled. "This way," Rhaegar said quietly. The others looked at him, surprised. He rarely spoke. He never took charge. But something in his voice, a cold certainty that didn't belong in a failure, made them follow. They moved through the first floor carefully. Rhaegar led them away from the main tunnels, following paths that his enhanced senses told him were safer. They encountered a few goblins, weak creatures that Rhaegar could have killed instantly with a shadow blade, but he held back. Let the others fight. Let them exhaust themselves. He couldn't reveal his power, not yet. Vance the brittle-boned boy tried to fight a goblin and shattered his arm. Ilara, the blind prophetess, screamed as she foresaw her own death in a vision. Timoth coughed blood into his hand. By the time they reached the stairway to the second floor, they were a mess. "Please," Timoth gasped, clutching Rhaegar's sleeve. "You know something, you're different, please help us." Rhaegar looked at the boy's desperate face. In his past life, he would have shrugged him off and moved on. The weak were weights, anchors that dragged you down. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the memory of his own desperation on the execution block, begging the kings for a mercy that never came. Maybe it was the simple fact that these people, these failures, were the only ones in the academy who had ever shown him anything resembling kindness. "Rest," Rhaegar said. "I'll scout ahead." He moved into the darkness alone, his step active, his shadow weaving a blade into his hand. The second floor was different from the first. The monsters here weren't random spawn. They were organized. He found goblins wearing crude armor, standing guard outside a tunnel. He found tracks of something much larger, something that dragged a heavy weight behind it. He followed the tracks to a cavern, and inside his blood ran cold. A massive creature sat in the center, its body a twisted fusion of flesh and stone. It had the upper body of a Chinese letter and the lower body of a serpent, and its eyes glowed with an unholy light. But that wasn't what made Rhaegar free. It was the energy radiating from the creature. Divine energy. This wasn't a natural monster. This was a construct, a war beast created by a king and left here to feed on the desperate souls who ventured too deep. The Academy knew. They had placed this thing here intentionally, a secret weapon to ensure that even if the failures survived the goblins, they would never reach the bottom. Rhaegar's grip tightened on his shadow blade. This creature was a message, a declaration. The kings didn't just ignore the weak, they actively engineered their destruction. They stacked the deck, rigged the game, and laughed as the losers died screaming. He turned and walked back to the others. "The path is clear," he lied. "We move now." They descended to the second floor, trusting him completely. Rhaegar led them through a maze of tunnels, always staying ahead of the patrols, always avoiding the cavern where the divine beast waited. He could have killed it. He knew he could, but not without revealing his power and not without risking the others. The beast was strong. A fight would draw attention, collapse tunnels, and bury them all. But as they approached the stairway to the third floor, a scream echoed through the cave. It was a student's scream, cut short by a wet crunch. The others froze. Rhaegar's eyes narrowed. There were other groups in the dungeon, other failures taking different paths, and one of them had just found the beast. "We have to help them," Ilara cried, her blind eyes turning toward the sound. "If we go there, we die," Vance said, cradling his broken arm. Rhaegar stood at a crossroad. The assassin in him said, "Keep moving. Protect the mission." The beast wasn't his problem, but the man who had been executed for a crime he didn't commit, the man who had watched the king smile as he died, felt something shift in his chest. "They're just like me," he thought, discarded, forgotten prey. He turned to the others. "Stay here. Don't move. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, go to the third floor without me." Before they could argue, he vanished into the shadows. He moved faster than he ever had, his step carrying him through the darkness like a ghost. He reached the cavern in moments. What he saw there made the cold hate in his heart burn hotter. The beast had caught a group of 5 students. 3 were already dead, their bodies crushed and broken. The remaining 2, a boy and a girl, were pinned beneath its massive claws, screaming as it lowered its head toward them, divine energy gathering in its maw for a killing blast. Rhaegar didn't think, he moved. His shadow blade extended into a spear, and he hurled it with all his strength. The spear flew through the air and struck the beast in the eye, sinking deep. The creature roared, a sound that shook the cavern, and reared back, releasing the student. The boy and girl scrambled away, staring in shock as Rhaegar stepped out of the shadow. "What are you waiting for?" he snapped. "Run." They ran. Rhaegar turned to face the beast. It had pulled the shadow spear from its eye, but the wound wasn't healing. Divine energy or not, shadow weapons left wounds that didn't close. The beast glared at him with its remaining eye, recognizing him as a threat, and charged. Rhaegar wove shadows into a wall, buying himself a second. Then another. Then another. The beast smashed through each one, but each barrier slowed it, gave him time to think. He couldn't kill it quickly without unsealing the Kingslayer arts, and that would drain his essence and alert every divine entity in the region. But he didn't need to kill it. He just needed to slow it down. He formed a net of shadows and cast it over the beast's head, tangling its limbs. The creature thrashed, ripping the net apart, but by the time it freed itself, Rhaegar was gone. He rejoined his group, breathing hard, and gestured toward the stairs. "Move, now." They didn't ask questions, they ran. The third floor was anticlimactic. A simple altar stood in a small chamber, glowing with faint light. The group touched it together, and a chime announced their success. The dungeon's exit opened, a staircase leading up to the surface. They emerged into daylight 3 days later, the only survivors of the culling. Of the 30 students who entered, only 12 came out. The others had died to goblins, to traps, to the beast that Rhaegar had briefly fought. Commander Vex looked at them with surprise, then suspicion. "You actually made it." Rhaegar met his gaze, his face blank. "We did." Vex's eyes narrowed. He didn't believe it, but with witnesses and the dungeon's own confirmation, there was nothing he could do. The failures had passed. As they walked back to Barracks 7, the other survivors looked at Rhaegar with something new in their eyes. Not pity, not dismissal, gratitude and curiosity. Timoth walked beside him, his cough miraculously better after 3 days away from the academy's polluted air. "You saved us," he said quietly. "In the cavern, I saw you. I followed. I saw what you did." Rhaegar stopped walking. He turned to look at the boy, and for a moment, the cold assassin mask slipped, revealing something tired and old beneath. "You saw nothing," Rhaegar said. Timoth nodded, understanding. "I saw nothing, but I know what I owe you." They walked on in silence, but something had changed. Rhaegar had saved lives. He had protected the weak. It was a foolish, sentimental thing to do, the kind of weakness that would get him killed in the long run. But as he looked at the ragtag group of survivors following him back to their leaky barracks, he realized something. He wasn't alone anymore, and in a world where the kings wanted him dead, having people who owed him their lives might be the most valuable currency of all. That night, as he lay in his bunk, the system activated again. New quest available. Title: The Seeds of Rebellion. Objective: build a network of trusted allies among the Academy's outcasts. Reward: unlock Shadow Network skill. Access to shared perception. Rhaegar stared at the window for a long moment. Then he looked around the barracks at the sleeping failures who now looked to him as a leader without even knowing it. They were weak. They were sick. They were cursed. But they were also invisible, forgotten, perfect. A network of shadows, hidden in plain sight, spreading across the academy like roots beneath the earth. It was exactly what he needed. He closed his eyes, a plan forming in his mind. The kings thought they were safe. They thought their power was absolute. They thought the failures would always fail. They were wrong, and soon they would learn just how wrong. Chapter 6: Echoes of the Black Dawn. The days following the dungeon crawl were strangely quiet. Too quiet. Rhaegar felt it in the air, a pressure like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. The academy continued its routine: classes, drills, meals. But something had shifted. The instructors watched the remedial students with new eyes. The patrols walked tighter routes. And twice, Rhaegar caught glimpses of black-robed figures moving through the corridors, figures that didn't belong to the faculty. The Inquisition had arrived. He first saw them formally on the 3rd day after the dungeon. The entire academy was summoned to the main courtyard for an assembly. Thousands of students stood in neat rows, their uniforms pressed, their faces curious. The remedial class was shoved to the back, as always, but Rhaegar didn't mind. The back was where the shadows lived. On the raised platform at the front of the courtyard stood Headmaster Aldrich, an ancient man whose power had long since faded but whose political connections kept him in office. Beside him stood 3 figures in black robes embroidered with silver eyes, the symbol of the Inquisition. Their faces were hidden beneath deep hoods, but Rhaegar could feel their gaze sweeping across the crowd like searchlights. "Students of the Celestial Hero Academy," Headmaster Aldrich began, his voice carrying through a minor amplification spell. "We are honored today by the presence of the Holy Inquisition. They come with grave news." The lead inquisitor stepped forward and lowered her hood. She was a woman of perhaps 40, with sharp features and eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. Her hair was the color of ash, pulled back so tightly it stretched the skin of her forehead. Rhaegar's heart stopped. He knew her. In his past life, she had been the one who interrogated him after the treason charges were filed. Her name was Inquisitor Seraphine, and she was famous for extracting confessions from the innocent and guilty alike. She had spent 3 days with Rhaegar, using magic and mundane torture in equal measure, trying to get him to name co-conspirators. He had given her nothing, not because he was strong, but because he had nothing to give. He was innocent. She hadn't believed him. 3 weeks ago, Seraphine said, her voice carrying across the courtyard without any magical assistance, a divine entity was murdered, not merely killed but erased from existence. The Kingling of Ashford Forest, a minor deity who had served the Pantheon faithfully for 600 years, is no more. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Murdered kings. It was unthinkable, blasphemy, the stuff of ancient myths used to scare children. We have traced the resonance of the killing blow to this region, Seraphine continued. To this academy, someone among you, student or faculty, possesses the ability to slay the divine. This is not a blessing. This is a curse, a heresy, and we will find the heretic. Her eyes swept across the crowd, and for a moment they paused on the remedial class. On Rhaegar, he felt the weight of her gaze like a physical pressure, but he didn't look away. Looking away was guilt. He met her eyes with the blank, confused expression of a failure who didn't understand what was happening. Seraphine's gaze moved on. The Inquisition will conduct interviews with all students and staff, she announced. You will cooperate fully. You will hide nothing. The heretic will be found, and they will be purged in the name of the kings we serve. The assembly dissolved into chaos. Students whispered frantically, nobles paling at the thought of being interrogated, commoners terrified of being caught in the crossfire. Rhaegar moved with his class back toward Barracks 7, his mind racing. The Inquisition was here. They had traced the killing to the academy. That meant they had methods he didn't understand, divination or tracking magic that could follow the resonance of king slaying. He had been careful, but careful wasn't enough. He needed to be invisible. That night, he gathered his network. Timoth came first, slipping into the shadows beside Rhaegar behind the barracks. The boy's cough was nearly gone now, replaced by a quiet strength that had emerged during the dungeon crawl. He had seen Rhaegar fight the beast, and instead of fear, it had inspired loyalty. The Inquisition posted guards at all the exits, Timoth reported quietly. No one leaves without permission. They're locking the academy down. Rhaegar nodded, expected. The others. Elara is watching the main hall. Her blindness doesn't matter for listening. Vance is near the faculty quarters, pretending to look for medical help for his arm. He says the Inquisitors are meeting with Chinese letter students first, the nobles. They're asking about anyone acting strange, anyone with unusual powers. Anyone mention us? Timoth shook his head. No one ever mentions us. Good, their invisibility was working in his favor, but it wouldn't last. The Inquisition was thorough. They would eventually question the failures, and when they did, someone might remember Rhaegar's absence during the night of the Kingling's death. Someone might mention that he seemed different after the dungeon. He needed a distraction, something to draw the Inquisition's attention away from the shadows and toward the light. The opportunity came 2 days later. Prince Kael, the golden boy, the S-rank prodigy, was scheduled for a public duel against the top student from a rival academy. It was meant to be a showcase of Celestial's power, a political event attended by nobles and priests. The Inquisition would be there, watching, analyzing. Rhaegar saw his chance. The day of the duel dawned bright and clear. The arena was packed, thousands of students filling the stand, nobles in private boxes, priests chanting blessing. Rhaegar stood in the shadow of a support pillar near the back, his step active, invisible to the guards who scanned the crowd. Kael entered the arena to thunderous applause. He wore gleaming white armor, his sword glowing with divine light. His opponent, a hulking brute from the Northern War Academy, looked like a bear in comparison. The duel began, and it was beautiful. Kael moved like water, his blades singing through the air, each strike perfectly placed. The Northerner fought back with raw power, but Kael's divine blessing made him untouchable. Rhaegar watched not the fight but the spectator. The Inquisition sat in a private box near the headmaster, their hooded faces tracking Kael's movements with clinical interest. They were impressed. They saw the prince as a future asset, a weapon for the king. Let me give you something else to look at. Rhaegar reached into the shadows pooling at the base of his pillar and wove. He didn't create a weapon. He created something far more subtle, a thread of darkness, thinner than a hair, invisible in the bright sunlight. He sent it crawling across the arena floor, through the cracks in the stone, under the feet of the cheering crowd. The thread reached Kale just as he prepared his finishing strike. Rhaegar focused, and the thread touched the divine energy surrounding the prince's sword. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Kale's sword blazed with light as he brought it down for the final blow. But instead of a clean strike, the light exploded. A pillar of white fire shot into the sky, blinding everyone in the arena. The northerner was thrown back, his armor scorched. Kale screamed, not in pain but in shock, as his own power raged out of control. The divine energy lashed out in all directions, burning seats, scorching banners, sending nobles diving for cover. It lasted only seconds, but when it faded, the arena was chaos. Kale stood in the center, his sword gone, his hands shaking, his perfect composure shattered. I didn't, he stammered. The Inquisition was on their feet. Seraphine's eyes were wide, not with concern but with suspicion. She was looking at Kale, at the uncontrolled eruption of divine power, and Rhaegar could see the questions forming in her mind. What if the heretic isn't hiding in the shadows? What if they're standing in the light? He slipped away from his pillar and melted into the crowd, his work done. The Inquisition would investigate Kale now. They would dig into his past, his training, his connections. They would find nothing, of course, but by the time they realized that, Rhaegar would be long gone. Chapter 7. A Rival's Broken Faith. The days that followed were a masterclass in misdirection. The Inquisition descended on Prince Kale like wolves on a wounded stag. They interviewed his instructors, his friends, his servants. They examined his quarters, his equipment, his family history. The golden boy of the academy was suddenly under a microscope, and he didn't understand why. Rhaegar watched from the shadows as Kale's perfect world crumbled. The prince went from celebrated hero to suspected heretic in the span of a week. His divine blessing, once his greatest asset, was now evidence against him. If he could lose control once, the Inquisition perhaps he had lost control before. Perhaps he had wandered into Ashford Forest. Perhaps he had killed the kingling. It was nonsense, of course. Kale had been at the academy the entire time, surrounded by witnesses. But the Inquisition didn't need truth. They needed a suspect. And Kale, with his uncontrollable power and his proximity to the crime, was the perfect candidate. Rhaegar almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But not quite. The memory of the execution block was still too fresh. 3 weeks after the duel, the Inquisition finally cleared Kale of suspicion. They found no evidence linking him to the kingling's death, and the political pressure from his royal family forced them to back off. But the damage was done. Kale's reputation was tarnished. The other nobles looked at him with new eyes, eyes that held doubt instead of adoration. And the Inquisition was still here, still searching. Rhaegar sat in the shadows of the library one night, reading forbidden texts on divine anatomy that he had stolen from a locked cabinet. The system had given him a new quest after the duel, one that offered a permanent skill if he could evade the Inquisition for 30 days. He was halfway there. A soft footstep behind him. He didn't turn. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. Timoth emerged from the darkness, his face pale. Elara had a vision, a bad one. Rhaegar closed the book. "Tell me." She saw the Inquisition finding something. Not you, something else. A secret beneath the academy. She said it was sleeping, but the Inquisitors are going to wake it up. A secret beneath the academy. Rhaegar's mind raced through his memories of the past life. The academy had been built on ruins, ancient ruins that predated the current civilization. In his time as a hero, he had heard rumors of dungeons below dungeons, levels that even the headmaster didn't know about. If the Inquisition found something down there, something connected to the king. When, he asked. Soon, days. She saw Seraphine walking down stone stairs holding a torch. There were carvings on the walls, carvings of stars falling from the sky. Stars falling, the Scarlet Star, his star. Rhaegar stood. "I need to see this place before they do. Can Elara guide me?" Timoth nodded. "She said you would ask. She's waiting outside the old kitchen, the one that was sealed after the fire." The old kitchen was in the oldest part of the academy, a section that had been closed off decades ago after a grease fire had killed a dozen servants. It was considered haunted, cursed, a place where students dared each other to go at night, and then ran away screaming at the first shadow. Perfect cover for a hidden entrance. Rhaegar found Alara sitting against the wall, her blind eyes staring at nothing. She looked up as he approached, her head tilting slightly. "You're quiet," she said, "even quieter than the others. My visions can't see you clearly. You're always in shadow." "That's useful," Rhaegar said. "Where are the stairs?" Alara pointed toward a collapsed section of wall. "Behind that, there's a door. The vision showed me how to open it. Press the third stone from the left, the one that's darker than the others." Rhaegar moved the debris aside and found the door, a heavy slab of stone covered in dust. He pressed the third stone, and the door swung inward on silent hinges. Cold air rushed out, carrying the smell of ancient stone and something else, something metallic. "Wait here," he said. "If I'm not back in an hour, wake Timoth and tell him to get everyone out of the barracks. Hide in the forest until the Inquisition leaves." Alara nodded, her face serious. "Be careful, Rhaegar, the thing in the vision. It was old, older than the kings." He descended. The stairs went down further than he expected, deeper than any dungeon he had explored in his past life. The walls were covered in carvings just as Alara had described, and as his eyes adjusted, he made out the images. Stars falling from the sky, stars shaped like eyes, stars bleeding onto the earth. And at the bottom of the stairs, a door, not made of stone but of something else. Something that looked like solidified light, long since faded to gray. There were no handles, no hinges, just a surface covered in writing that the system suddenly translated. "Warning, divine seal detected. Classification, pre-Pantheon. Contents unknown. Threat level." Rhaegar reached out to touch the door, and the world screamed. Not a real sound, a psychic one. A warning that blasted through his mind and made him stagger back, blood trickling from his nose. The door pulsed with faint light, and for a moment he saw something on the other side. A shape, a mass of shadows and eyes and wings. Something that had been imprisoned here for millennia, something that predated the kings themselves. And it was looking at him. "Who dares?" The voice was not speech but pure meaning, pressed directly into his consciousness. "Who disturbs the prison of the nameless?" Rhaegar's hand went to his shadow blade, but he didn't draw it. This thing, whatever it was, felt wrong. Not divine, not demonic, something else entirely. "I'm Rhaegar," he said, his voice steady despite the blood and the pain. "I kill kings." Silence. Then something that might have been laughter. "Little mortal, little star. You kill the parasites that sit on thrones of stolen light. But do you know what came before them? Do you know what they imprisoned to build their kingdom? I'm beginning to get an idea." More laughter. "Come back when you've killed more of them. Come back when the sky bleeds. And perhaps, little star, we will talk." The presence withdrew. The door went dark. Rhaegar stood there for a long moment, his heart pounding, his mind reeling. Then he turned and climbed back up the stairs. He had found something beneath the academy, something the kings had hidden, something that might be an ally or might be an even greater enemy. Either way, it changed everything. The next morning, the Inquisition announced they were expanding their search. They had detected traces of ancient magic beneath the academy, magic that predated the current divine order. They were going to excavate. Rhaegar watched from the shadows as Seraphine led a team of inquisitors toward the old kitchen. They had found the entrance. They were going to find the door, and if they opened it, if they released whatever was down there. He couldn't let that happen. Not yet. Not until he understood what he was dealing with. He needed to slow them down, distract them again, give himself time to think. And he knew exactly how. That night, a fire broke out in the Inquisition's temporary headquarters. Small, easily contained, but large enough to destroy their notes, their maps, their tracking equipment. The Inquisitors spent the night fighting flames and saving documents, and by morning their excavation was delayed by at least a week. Rhaegar watched from a rooftop as Seraphine screamed at her subordinates, her perfect composure finally cracking. She knew someone was mocking her, someone was playing game, and she was going to find them if it was the last thing she did. But not today. Today she was too busy putting out fires. Rhaegar smiled and melted back into the shadows. The game was far from over, but for the first time since his execution, he was the one setting the rule. Chapter 8. The Oracle's Vision of Ruin. The fire bought him time, but not much. 3 days after the flames died, the Inquisition had already requisitioned new equipment from the capital. They worked with a fury that bordered on obsession. their black robes appearing in every corridor, every classroom, every shadow. Seraphine personally oversaw the excavation of the old kitchen, standing at the top of the ancient stairs while her subordinates chipped away at the sealed entrance to the lower level. Rhaegar watched from the shadows of a collapsed pantry, his step active, his breathing controlled. He could feel the presence of the thing behind the door, a faint pulse in the back of his mind like a second heartbeat. It was waiting, watching, and it knew he was there. They will open it soon, the voice whispered in his thoughts. The parasites are determined. They sense something old beneath their feet, and they cannot bear the unknown. Rhaegar didn't respond. Speaking to the entity in his mind felt dangerous, like inviting a wolf into your home, but he couldn't deny the truth of its words. The Inquisition would break through eventually, and when they did, they would either release the prisoner or destroy it. Either outcome was unpredictable, and Rhaegar hated unpredictability. He needed more information, and there was only one person in the academy who might have it. Archmage Lyanna. She worked late. That was something Rhaegar remembered from his past life, a habit that had made her vulnerable to betrayal then and made her vulnerable to observation now. Every night, long after the last student had left, she sat in her tower office, reading, researching, planning. She was ambitious, always had been, and ambition required sacrifice. Rhaegar slipped through the tower's base level, past the sleeping guards, up the spiral stair. The shadows here were thick, old stone soaked in centuries of magic, and they welcomed him like an old friend. His step carried him silently, his breath barely a whisper. He reached her door and paused. Through the crack he could see her sitting at a massive desk, her back to him, her silver hair catching the candlelight. She was reading an ancient text, its pages yellowed and crumbling, and she was muttering to herself. Pre-Pantheon structures, divine seals, if the resonance matches. Rhaegar eased the door open just wide enough to slip through. He moved along the wall, keeping to the shadows until he was close enough to read over her shoulder. The text was written in a language he didn't recognize, but the illustrations were clear. A door, a prison, a shape with too many eyes. The nameless, Lyanna whispered. They actually existed. Rhaegar's blood ran cold. She knew. She was researching the same thing he had found. He should have killed her then. It would have been easy. A shadow blade to the throat and the ambitious archmage would never betray anyone again. But something stopped him. Not mercy. He had none left for her. But curiosity. What else did she know? What other secrets did that ancient text hold? He waited. Lyanna turned the page and Rhaegar's eyes widened. There, drawn in faded ink, was a star. A red star, falling from the sky, trailing blood, striking the earth and shattering the divine realm. The Scarlet Star, Lyanna breathed. The omen of king slaying. The prophets wrote of it, but everyone thought it was metaphor. What if it was literal? What if a person? She trailed off, her hand touching the illustration. For a moment, her face held something Rhaegar hadn't seen in either timeline. Wonder, awe, the look of a scholar on the verge of a discovery that would rewrite history. Then she shook her head and closed the book. Ridiculous. The kings are eternal. They cannot be killed by mortal hand. She stood and walked to a cabinet, pouring herself a glass of wine. Rhaegar remained motionless, considering his options. He could take the book. He could destroy it. But that would alert her to his presence, confirm that someone else knew about the nameless and the star. Instead, he slipped out as silently as he had entered, leaving her to her research. He would watch her, learn from her, and when the time came, he would use her knowledge against her. Chapter 9. Ascension to the Divine Realm. The excavation took 8 days. Rhaegar tracked every moment of it through his network. Alara listened from the upper floors, her supernatural hearing picking up the conversations of the Inquisitor. Vance watched from the shadows of the old kitchen, his brittle bones making him slow, but his eyes sharp. Timoth befriended a servant assigned to clean the excavation site, trading small favors for information. By the 7th day, they knew everything. The door was made of something called star metal, an alloy that didn't exist in the current age. The writing on it was pre-Pantheon, a language that even the Inquisition scholars couldn't fully translate. But they had deciphered enough to know that whatever was inside was dangerous. Very dangerous. Seraphine had sent a message to the capital, requesting permission to open the door. The response came back on the evening of the 7th day. Proceed with extreme caution. The Pantheon is watching. Rhaegar stood on the roof of Barrack 7 that night, looking up at the stars. The system pulsed gently in the corner of his vision, a constant reminder of his mission. 31 kings slain. He had killed one. A minor kingling. The real kings, the ones who sat on thrones in the divine realm, were infinitely more powerful. But if the thing behind the door was their enemy, "You're thinking of making a deal," the voice whispered. It came from everywhere and nowhere, seeping into his mind like fog. "You're thinking of freeing me to fight your war." Rhaegar didn't turn. He had learned that the entity could see him regardless of where he looked. "I'm considering option. The parasites will open my prison tomorrow. They will see me and they will be afraid, and then they will try to destroy me. They will fail, of course, but the attempt will be entertaining." "You sound confident." "I have waited millennia. A few more hours are nothing. But you little star, you are interesting. You carry the scent of death, King Death. You have killed one of them and you plan to kill more." "Yes, why?" Rhaegar thought about the execution block, the axe, the crowd, the silence from heaven. "They killed me first. Now I'm returning the favor." Laughter echoed in his mind, ancient and vast. "Such mortal simplicity, I like it. Perhaps we can help each other, you and I. When the parasites open my door, there will be chaos. In that chaos you could act, kill more of them, grow stronger, and when you are strong enough you could free me completely." "And what would you do then?" "What I was made for, tear down their kingdom, devour their light, leave nothing but shadow and silence." Rhaegar considered this. An ally against the kings was tempting, but an ally who wanted to devour everything was just another enemy waiting to happen. "I'll think about it," he said. "Think quickly, little star. Time is running out." The 8th day dawned cold and gray. The entire academy felt the shift in the air, a pressure that made heads ache and tempers short. Classes were canceled. Students huddled in their dormitories, whispering about the Inquisition's excavation. The faculty gathered in the main hall, their faces tense. Rhaegar was in the old kitchen, hidden in a shadow so deep that even the rats avoided it. He watched as Seraphine led her team down the ancient stairs, their torches casting flickering light on the carvings of falling stars. Behind them came 2 priests, their hands glowing with divine magic, ready to contain whatever emerged. The descent took an hour. Rhaegar followed at a distance, his step making him invisible, his shadow weave silencing his footsteps. He reached the bottom just as the Inquisitors gathered before the star-metal door. Seraphine studied the writing, her lips moving as she read the translations her scholars had provided. "It says, 'Here lies the nameless, the enemy of light, imprisoned for crimes against the divine. Let none who value their souls open this door.'" The priests shifted uneasily. One of them, a young man with fear in his eyes, spoke up. "Inquisitor, perhaps we should wait for further instruction from the Pantheon. This feels wrong." Seraphine's gaze snapped to him. "The Pantheon told us to proceed. Are you questioning the kings?" "And no, Inquisitor, you just nothing. We will open the door, we will see what's inside, and if it threatens the divine order, we will destroy it." She turned to the 2 priests. "Prepare your magic. On my signal, seal anything that emerges." The priests nodded, their hands glowing brighter. Seraphine approached the door and placed her palm against its cold surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door began to glow, not with divine light, with something darker, something that drank the light from the torches and made the shadows deeper. The writing on the door shifted, rearranging itself into words that everyone present could understand. "You have been warned." The door swung open, and the screaming began. Rhaegar saw it only in glimpses, fragments that his mind struggled to process. A shape that was not a shape, eyes that opened in places eyes shouldn't be, wings that folded through dimension, and at the center, a void that pulled at his soul, demanding he step closer, surrender, become part of the nothing. The priests tried to seal it. Their divine light flared, striking the entity, and the entity laughed. The light didn't hurt it, it fed it. The entity grew larger, darker, more present, until the priests were screaming too, their magic draining into the void, their bodies crumbling to ash. Seraphine stumbled back, her face white with terror for the first time since Rhaegar had seen her. She raised her hand, a spell forming, but the entity turned its attention to her, and she froze. "Ah," the voice said, filling the chamber. "A true believer, how delicious." "No," Seraphine whispered. "You're not real, you're a myth, a legend. All legends are real somewhere. I am real here, and I am hungry." The entity reached for her, shadows coiling like tentacles, and Rhaegar knew he had to act. Not to save her, he would happily watch her die, but to control the situation. If the entity killed everyone and escaped, it would rampage across the continent. The kings would descend to stop it, and in the chaos, Rhaegar's mission would become infinitely harder. He stepped out of the shadows. Stop it. The entity paused. Its countless eyes turned toward him, and he felt their weight like a physical force. But he didn't flinch. He met that ancient gaze with the cold eyes of an assassin. Little star, you interrupt my meal. Release her and listen. Seraphine stared at Rhaegar, her eyes wide with shock. She recognized him now, the failure from the remedial class, the boy with the useless blessing. But he stood before the nameless without fear, and that made no sense. The entity chuckled. Release her. Why would I do that? Because if you kill her, the kings will come. All of them. And you're not strong enough to fight them all yet. You've been imprisoned for millennia. You need time. Time to feed. Time to grow. Kill her now and you lose that time. Silence. The entity's eyes blinked in sequence, a wave of darkness that swept across its form. Then slowly, the shadows retreated from Seraphine. She collapsed to the ground, gasping. You speak wisely, little star, for a mortal. I've had practice. Rhaegar turned to Seraphine. Get up. Walk out of here. Tell your superiors that the prison was empty, that the legends were wrong. If you say anything else, I'll let it finish what it started. Seraphine looked at him, at the entity, at the dead priests scattered across the floor. Her mind was racing, trying to process the impossible, but survival instinct won. She scrambled to her feet and ran. The entity watched her go, then turned back to Rhaegar. You saved her. Why? Because she's useful, she's ambitious, she wants power. Eventually she'll turn against the kings whether she means to or not, and when she does, I'll be there. You think far ahead, little star, I like that. The entity's form shifted, contracting until it stood before him as a vaguely humanoid shape of living shadow. I am called many names. The Nameless, the Shadow Eater, the first enemy, but you may call me Valthar. Rhaegar. I know. Valthar's eyes, 2 points of deeper darkness in its shadow face, studied him. You want my help killing the kings. I want your help regaining my power. An alliance then. For now. But understand this. If you threaten innocence, if you feed on the weak, I'll find a way to put you back in that prison. Or worse. Valthar laughed, a sound like distant thunder. You threaten me. Mortal, I have eaten beings older than your entire species. I have watched stars born and die. You are nothing. Maybe, but I'm the only one who can get you close to the kings without alerting them. I'm the only one who knows their weaknesses. And I'm the only one who's killed one of them. Rhaegar's eyes didn't waver. So yes, I threaten you. Deal with it. A long pause. Then Valthar bowed, a gesture that was both mocking and sincere. Very well, little star. We will play this your way. For now. They left the chamber together, Rhaegar and the shadow entity. The Inquisition's equipment lay scattered, abandoned in the panic. The bodies of the priests had crumbled to dust, their souls consumed. Above, the academy waited in ignorance. As they climbed the stairs, Valthar spoke again. There is something you should know, little star. The kings are afraid, not of me, they've always feared me, but of something else, something they saw in the future. What? A red star, falling, a mortal who would tear down their thrones and drink their light. They've been trying to prevent it for centuries. They've killed anyone who showed signs of becoming that star, but they never found the right one, until now. Rhaegar stopped walking. They know about me. Not yet, but they will. The vision that Oracle will have, the one that's coming soon, it will show them exactly what to look for, and when it does, they will send everything they have to destroy you. How soon? Days, perhaps a week. The Festival of Stars is approaching. The High Oracle will channel the Pantheon's will, and she will see you. Rhaegar stood in the darkness of the ancient stairs, his mind racing. The timeline had just accelerated dramatically. He wasn't ready to fight the full power of the king. He needed more strength, more allies, more time. But time was the one thing he didn't have. Then we move first, he said quietly. Before the festival, before the vision, we go to them. Valthar's eyes gleamed. You want to attack the divine realm, now. Little star, that's suicide. Probably. But sitting here waiting to die is definitely suicide. At least this way, I choose the battlefield. The entity considered this, then nodded slowly. I like you, mortal. You have the soul of a predator. Very well. Show me where they live and I will help you hunt. Rhaegar turned and continued up the stairs. Valthor flowing beside him like a second shadow. Above, the academy waited in ignorance. The festival of stars was coming. The oracle would soon see the future, and Rhaegar would make sure that future never came to pass. Chapter 10. The First Heavenly Slaughter. The portal opened in the ruins of the old kitchen, where the walls were still scarred by Valthor's emergence. It wasn't a hole in the air so much as a tear in reality itself, a wound that bled colors that didn't exist and light that cast no shadow. Through there lies the hunting grounds, Valthor said, the domain of the king of hunters and his beastly legion. It's the lowest plane of the divine realm, closest to the mortal world. If we can take it, we gain a foothold, a place to retreat, to regroup, to strike from. The king of hunters, Rhaegar repeated. What's his weakness? Arrogance. He sees mortals as prey, never as hunters. He won't expect an attack. He won't even believe it's possible until your blade is in his throat. Good. Rhaegar turned to look back at the academy one last time. Somewhere in Barrack 7, Timoth was sleeping, his cough finally quiet. Alara was dreaming, her visions showing her things she shouldn't see. They were failures, outcasts, the forgotten children of a world that valued only the strong. But they were his now, his network, his people, and he was walking into a war that might kill him before he could ever see them again. Let's go. He stepped through the tier. The divine realm was nothing he expected, and everything the sky was wrong, not blue or black, but a shifting tapestry of gold and purple, lit by sources that didn't exist. The ground beneath his feet was soft, covered in grass that glowed faintly, each blade a tiny star. In the distance, mountains rose toward the heaven, their peaks lost in clouds that moved against the wind. And the air itself was alive, thick with divine energy that made his skin tingle and his lungs burn. Every breath was a struggle, as if the realm itself rejected his mortal presence. Valthor materialized beside him, solid now in a way he hadn't been in the mortal world. The entity's shadow form seemed sharper, more defined, as if the divine realm's light gave him edges. It's been millennia since I stood on this soil, he murmured, something almost like nostalgia in his voice. The hunting grounds haven't changed, still beautiful, still deadly. As if on cue, a howl echoed across the plain. Not a wolf's howl, something deeper, more ancient, more hungry. Others answered, and soon the air was filled with the sound of a hunt beginning. They know we're here, Rhaegar said. Of course, this is the king of hunters' domain. Every living thing within these borders is his prey or his tool. The moment we stepped through, we became the former. Valthor's eyes gleamed. But that works in our favor. He'll send his beasts. He'll watch from his palace, waiting to see how we die. He won't expect us to survive. He certainly won't expect us to hunt him back. Rhaegar drew his shadow blade. It materialized from the darkness at his feet, longer and sharper than ever before, drinking the golden light of this realm and returning only blackness. Then let's not keep him waiting. The first wave came within minutes. They were hounds, if hounds could be the size of horses and have teeth like daggers. Their eyes glowed with divine fire, and their howls carried the weight of judgment. There were dozens of them, pouring over a nearby hill like a tide of fur and fangs. Rhaegar didn't wait for them to reach him. He moved. The step carried him forward faster than thought, and he was among them before they could react. His shadow blade swept through the neck of the lead hound, and the beast collapsed, its divine fire extinguishing with a wet gasp. He spun, blade meeting fang, shadow meeting light, and two more hounds fell. But there were too many. They surrounded him, snapping, clawing, driving him back. One lunged for his throat and he barely dodged, its teeth closing on empty air inches from his face. Another raked his side with claws that burned like acid, and he gasped, stumbling. Valthor moved. The entity exploded outward, no longer a man but a storm of darkness that engulfed the hound. They screamed, actually screamed, their divine fire guttering and dying as the shadows consumed them. In seconds, the field was silent, littered with the corpses of beasts that had never known death until now. Valthor reformed, his shadow face hungry, delicious. I'd forgotten how delicious divine flesh tastes. Rhaegar pressed a hand to his side. The wound was already healing, the system, or perhaps Valthor's presence, accelerating his recovery, but it hurt like nothing he'd felt before. Divine weapons left wounds that remembered. Next time, don't wait so long. Next time, don't rush in like a fool. We're in the divine realm now, little star. The rules are different here. You can't just rely on mortal speed and shadow tricks. These beasts have been hunting for millennia. They know every move you'll make before you make it. Then I'll make moves they don't know. Valthor chuckled. That's the spirit. Now come. The palace is that way, and the king of hunters is waiting. They traveled through the hunting grounds for what felt like hours, though time moved strangely. The sun, if it was a sun, never shifted in the sky, and the stars remained fixed, watching them with cold disinterest. Along the way, they encountered more beasts, giant wolves with wings, serpents that burrowed through the ground and struck without warning, birds of prey that dove from the clouds with talons that could shred steel. Rhaegar killed them all. With each kill, the system pulsed, awarding essence, unlocking fragments of the Kingslayer arts. He learned to move not just through shadow, but through the spaces between heartbeats. He learned to strike not just at flesh, but at the divine core that powered these creatures. He learned to feed on their death, absorbing their strength, growing stronger with every fall. By the time they reached the palace of the King of Hunters, Rhaegar was no longer the same man who had stepped through the portal. He stood at the base of a mountain carved into the shape of a colossal beast, its stone eyes staring down at him with the cold judgment of a king. The palace entrance was a massive maw, teeth of marble and gold waiting to consume anyone who entered. He knows we're here, Valthor said. He's been watching since we killed the first hound. He's curious now, curious and amused. A mortal hunting in his domain. It's a game to him. Then let's show him how the game ends. Rhaegar walked into the maw. The throne room was a vast cavern lit by torches that burned with captured starlight. Trophies lined the walls, skulls of beasts, weapons of fallen heroes, relics of civilizations long since crumbled to dust. And at the far end, on a throne made of intertwined bones, sat the King of Hunters. He was beautiful in the way that predators were beautiful, muscles coiled beneath skin that gleamed like polished bronze, eyes the color of blood, watching, calculating, hungry. A crown of antlers rose from his brow, each point sharp enough to pierce the soul. He smiled as Rhaegar entered. "A mortal," he said, his voice like the purr of a great cat. "It's been centuries since a mortal dared set foot in my domain, and such a mortal too. No divine blessing, no sacred weapons, just a boy with a shadow and a dream." He laughed and the sound shook the cavern. "Tell me, boy, did you come here to die, or did you come here to entertain me?" Rhaegar stopped in the center of the room, his shadow blade hanging loosely at his side. Valthor had melted into the darkness, waiting, watching, ready. "I came here to kill you," Rhaegar said simply. The King of Hunters laughed again, louder this time, and his laughter was echoed by the trophies on the walls. The skulls rattling, the weapons humming, as if the entire room was alive with mockery. "Kill me with that. A shadow knife and a pet darkness. Boy, I have hunted things that make your nightmares look like children's stories. I have slain heroes who could shatter mountains. The thought. I have feasted on the souls of kings and demons. And you think you can kill me? I know I can." The king's eyes narrowed, amusement giving way to something sharper. "You have the stench of death about you. King Death, you killed one of mine. A kingling perhaps feeding on peasants in some backwater forest." He rose from his throne and the room seemed to shrink around him. "You killed my child, and for that you will suffer." He moved. Even with the step, even with the Kingslayer arts awakening in his blood, Rhaegar barely saw him coming. The king was faster than thought, faster than light, his hand closing around Rhaegar's throat and lifting him off the ground before he could react. "See," the king murmured, his bloody eyes inches from Rhaegar's face. "You're just prey, like all the others." Rhaegar choked, his feet kicking uselessly, but his mind was calm, cold, calculating. Now he thought. Valthor erupted from the shadows beneath the throne, a tidal wave of darkness that slammed into the king from behind. The king staggered, his grip loosening. Rhaegar dropped, gasping. But he didn't stop. He lunged forward, shadow blade extended, and drove it deep into the king's side. The king screamed. It was a sound that had never been heard in this realm, a sound of pain and shock and disbelief. Divine blood sprayed across the floor, golden and steaming, and the king stumbled, clutching his wound. You dare." Rhaegar didn't answer. He struck again, and again, each blow finding a new weakness, a new crack in the divine armor. The system guided his hands, showing him where the king's core pulsed, where his soul resided, where a single perfect strike could end him. But the king was old, older than most. He recovered faster than Rhaegar expected, lashing out with a backhand that sent Rhaegar flying across the room. He crashed into the wall of trophies, skulls raining down around him, and tasted blood in his mouth. "Impressive," the king growled, advancing. "You actually drew blood. No mortal has done that in 10,000 years. I'll treasure your screams." Valther struck again, wrapping the king in shadows, but the king tore through them like paper. He was too strong, too ancient, too powerful. Valther, still weakened from millennia of imprisonment, couldn't hold him. Rhaegar, the entity, shouted in his mind. "Now or never, the core, strike the core." Rhaegar pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest. The king was almost upon him, his bloody eyes blazing with murderous intent. There was no time to think, no time to plan, no time for anything but instinct. He threw himself forward, not at the king's chest, but at his feet. He slid between the king's legs, shadow blade reversed, and drove it upward with all his remaining strength. The blade found the core. It was buried deep in the king's spine, a knot of divine energy that pulsed with the rhythm of creation itself. The shadow blade pierced it, and the king froze. For one eternal moment, nothing happened. Then the king of hunters exploded into light. The blast threw Rhaegar across the room again, but this time the impact was soft, cushioned by the debris of the king's destruction. He lay there, gasping, bleeding, barely conscious, as the light faded and the screaming stopped. When he could finally open his eyes, the throne room was gone. The trophies, the torches, the bone throne, all of it had crumbled to dust. Only Rhaegar remained, and Valther, who stood over him with something like respect in his shadow. "You did it," the entity said quietly. "You actually did it. You killed a king. A real king, not a kingling, not a servant, one of the Pantheon." Rhaegar coughed, blood spattering his lips. "Feels like I died too." "Almost, but not quite." Valther extended a hand, helping him up. "The system is processing the kill. Look." Rhaegar blinked and saw the familiar red window. "King slain. Hunter, servant of the hunt. Rank, major deity. Reward, 50,000 Slayer essence. Skill unlocked. Kingslayer Arts seconds. Primary quest updated to King slain. 50,000 essence. Enough to buy anything in the shop. Enough to grow stronger than he'd ever imagined. But more than that, the second seal of the Kingslayer Arts had unlocked. He could feel it, a new understanding flowing into his mind, techniques and powers that had been hidden until now. Valther was staring at the sky, or rather, at the place where the sky should have been. The hunting grounds were shaking, the divine realm destabilizing without its king to anchor it. "We need to leave. Now, the other kings will have felt this. They'll be coming." Rhaegar nodded, too exhausted to speak. Valther opened a portal, a tier back to the mortal world, and together they stepped through. Behind them, the hunting grounds crumbled into nothing, the first divine domain to fall in millennia. And in the heavens above, the remaining kings gathered in panic, staring at the empty space where their brother had once stood. The Scarlet Star had risen, and the hunt had only just begun. Chapter 11, The Fall of Kings. The portal spat them out into the ruins of the old kitchen, and Rhaegar collapsed immediately. His body had reached its limit. Every muscle screamed, every bone felt like it had been shattered and poorly reset. The divine blood coating his skin was already evaporating, turning to golden mist that rose toward the ceiling and vanished. Valther stood over him, solid for once, his shadow form retaining human shape with difficulty. The entity had fed well in the divine realm, consuming fragments of the King of Hunters' essence as Rhaegar delivered the killing blow. He looked stronger, more defined, almost solid in places. "Rest," Valther said, his voice carrying none of its usual mockery. "You've earned it. The kings will need time to gather, to plan. You have at least a day before they decide what to do about you." Rhaegar wanted to respond, wanted to ask about the second seal, about the 50,000 essence, about what came next. But his eyes were already closing, consciousness slipping away like water through fingers. When he woke, he was in his bunk in Barracks 7, a cold cloth on his forehead and Timoth's worried face hovering above him. "You've been out for 2 days, the boy said quietly. "We thought you were dying. You kept muttering things about kings, about hunting, about a shadow that eats light. Alara said you were fighting something in your dreams." Rhaegar sat up slowly, his body aching but whole. The wounds from the divine realm had healed, leaving only faint scars that pulsed with a strange inner light when he moved. 2 days, he repeated. The Festival of Stars. Tomorrow, they've doubled the guards, brought in extra priests. Everyone's talking about the blood rain. Rhaegar frowned. Blood rain. Timoth's face paled. You didn't know? The night you disappeared, it rained. But not water, blood, golden blood falling from the sky like tears. People panicked. The priests said it was a sign from the kings, a blessing. But it didn't feel like a blessing. It felt like mourning. A king's death, Rhaegar realized. The king of hunters had been so powerful that his passing had bled into the mortal world. The golden blood rain was divine ichor, falling across the continent, marking the first true death in the Pantheon for millennia. The implications were staggering. Every priest, every faithful, every mortal who had seen that rain would know something had changed. The Inquisition would be in chaos. The Academy would be on high alert. And the remaining kings would be terrified. Chapter 12. The Oracle's Vision. The Festival of Stars dawned bright and terrible. From sunrise, the sky was wrong. Clouds moved against the wind. Birds flew in circles, refusing to land. And in the distance, thunder rumbled despite not a single storm cloud in sight. The entire academy gathered in the Grand Cathedral, a building that could hold 10,000 worshippers and still have room for more. Rhaegar stood with the remedial class, shoved to the back as always, but this time he didn't mind. The back was where the shadows lived, and today, more than ever, he needed the shadows. At the front of the cathedral, an altar had been erected. Not the small altar used for daily blessings, but the great altar, the one reserved for direct communication with the Pantheon, and before it stood the High Oracle. She was ancient, older than anyone in the academy, older than the headmaster, older than the building itself. Her skin was the color of parchment, her eyes milky white with blindness, her hair a wisp of silver that floated around her head as if moved by an unfelt wind. She wore robes of pure white, and in her hand she held a staff topped with a crystal that pulsed with inner light. "People of the Celestial Hero Academy," Headmaster Aldrich announced, his voice trembling slightly. "Today, on this most holy of days, the High Oracle shall channel the will of the Pantheon. She shall see the future, and we shall witness the glory of the king." The crowd murmured in awe. Rhaegar felt Valther's presence at the edge of his consciousness, the entity hiding in shadows so deep that even the oracle's divine sight couldn't penetrate. "This is it," Valther whispered, "the moment of truth. If she sees you, the kings will know exactly who to look for. They'll send everything they have. Then I'll make sure she doesn't see me. You can't hide from an oracle's vision. It's not about seeing you now. It's about seeing you in the future, in every possible future. If you exist in any of them, she'll know." Rhaegar's jaw tightened. He had to try. The oracle raised her staff, and the crystal blazed with light. The cathedral dimmed, shadows retreating as divine power filled every corner. Rhaegar felt it pressing against him, against his shade blessing, against his connection to Valther. It was searching, probing, peeling back layers of reality to see what lay beneath. The oracle began to speak, her voice echoing with the weight of prophecy. I see a great darkness, a shadow that moves among mortals. It carries death in its hands, death for the divine. It has already struck once, twice. It will strike again." The crowd gasped. Rhaegar felt eyes turning, searching, but no one looked at him. "Not yet. I see a star, a red star falling from the heaven. It bleeds as it falls, and where its blood touches the earth, kings die. The star has a name. The star has a face." The oracle's milky eyes snapped open, and for one terrible moment she looked directly at Rhaegar, through him, into him. "I see, Rhaegar." The name exploded from her lips, and the cathedral shook. Divine light blasted from the crystal, sweeping across the crowd, and Rhaegar felt his shade blessing shatter like glass. He was exposed, visible, naked before the eyes of every person in the cathedral. "That's him," someone shouted. "The failure, the cursed one." Guards moved. Priests raised their hands, divine magic gathering. The crowd parted, leaving Rhaegar standing alone in a circle of empty space. And above, through the cathedral's crystal roof, the sky cracked open. Light poured through, not sunlight but divine radiance, the direct attention of the Pantheon. A voice boomed across the heavens, shaking the very foundations of the world. "Mortal, you have killed our brother. You have spilled divine blood. For this, there is only one punishment." Rhaegar looked up, and for the first time he saw them. Not statues or paintings or vague presences. The actual kings gathered at the edge of the mortal realm, their faces filling the sky. The king of war, armored and terrible. The queen of wisdom, cold and calculating. The king of justice, scales in hand. Dozens more, their forms too bright to look at directly, their power too immense to comprehend. Erasure, they spoke as, you shall be erased from existence. Your name, your deeds, your very soul shall be unmade, and all who aided you shall suffer the same fate. The crowd screamed. People ran, trampling each other in their panic. The guards fell to their knees, praying for mercy. Only Rhaegar stood, looking up at the kings who had killed him once and were about to kill him again. But this time he wasn't alone. Valther exploded from the shadows, no longer hiding, no longer patient. The entity grew and grew, his form expanding until he filled the cathedral, until he blotted out the divine light, until he stood between Rhaegar and the sky. You, the kings hissed, recognition and fear mixing in their voices. The nameless, you should still be imprisoned. I was, Valther rumbled, his voice shaking the world. But your little hunter let me out, and now I'm hungry. The kings recoiled. For all their power, for all their millennia of dominion, they remembered the nameless. They remembered what he had been before they imprisoned him. They remembered why they had feared him enough to trap him in the first place. Kill Them, the king of war commanded. Kill them both. Angels descended, thousands of them, their wings of light filling the sky, their swords of divine fire ready to strike. They poured through the crack in the heavens, a tidal wave of holy vengeance aimed directly at Rhaegar and Valther. Rhaegar drew his shadow blade, Valther grew spikes of darkness from his form, and together they faced the army of heaven. Remember what I told you, Rhaegar said quietly. I'd rather die on my feet, killing as many as I can. Valther laughed, a sound of pure joy. Then let's make them remember this day, little star. Let's make them remember the day the hunter became the hunted. The first wave of angels struck, and the battle for the mortal realm began. Chapter 13, The King of War. The first wave of angels died before they touched the ground. Valther's shadows erupted outward like the petals of a night-blooming flower, each tendril finding a throat, a wing, a heart. The angels screamed, high, keening sounds that shattered the cathedral's stained glass windows and sent the remaining worshippers fleeing in terror. Their divine light flickered and died as the shadows consumed them, their essence draining into the entity who had waited millennia for this feast. Rhaegar didn't wait to watch. He moved. The step carried him through the chaos. His shadow blade extended, finding the gaps in angelic armor that only a Kingslayer could see. The system guided his hand, showing him the weak points, the fractures, the places where divine flesh PARTD Chinese letter. He struck and struck and struck, and angels fell around him like burning stars. But there were too many. For every angel he killed, 10 more poured through the crack in the sky. For every 10 Valther consumed, 100 took their place. The cathedral was filling with light and fire and the thunderous roar of divine war, and Rhaegar realized with cold certainty that they couldn't win this fight. Not here, not now. Valther, he shouted through their connection, we need to fall back. Fall back where? The entity's voice was strained even as he fed. They're everywhere. The moment we retreat, they'll destroy the academy, the city, the entire continent. Rhaegar's mind raced. The academy, the students. Timoth, Alara, Vance, the others who had trusted him, followed him, believed they were still here, somewhere in the chaos, and if the angels didn't kill them, the panicked crowd would. He couldn't save everyone, he knew that, but he could save some. Cover me, he growled, and plunged into the cathedral. The scene inside was hell. Bodies lay everywhere, students, priests, guards, servants. The angels showed no mercy, striking down anyone in their path. Divine fire consumed pews and pillars. The roof was collapsing in places, huge chunks of stone crashing down and crushing the helpless. Rhaegar moved through it all like a ghost, his step carrying him past angels who were too focused on killing to notice one mortal moving against the tide. He reached the back of the cathedral, where the remedial class had been standing, and found them huddled behind an overturned pew. Timoth was there, a rusted sword in his hand, protecting Alara and Vance. His eyes widened as Rhaegar appeared. You're alive. Not for long if we stay here. Follow me, stay close, don't look back. He led them through the chaos, using shadows to hide their passage, using his blade to cut down any angel that got too close. They reached a side door, one that led to the old storage rooms, and Rhaegar kicked it open. Go through the tunnel. They lead to the old kitchen, then outside the walls. Don't stop running until you're in the forest. Timoth grabbed his arm. What about you? I have a date with some kings. Rhaegar pulled free. Go now. Timoth hesitated, then nodded. He led the others into the darkness, and Rhaegar turned back to the cathedral. But someone else was there, standing in the doorway behind him. Prince Kael. His white uniform was stained with blood, not his own, from the looks of it. His golden eyes blazed with something that might have been madness or revelation or both. In his hand, he held a sword that pulsed with divine light. You, he said, his voice hoarse. The failure, the shade, you're the one they're all afraid of. Rhaegar studied him, calculated. Kael could be a threat, could alert the angels to his presence, could delay him long enough to get them both killed. But there was something in the prince's eyes that hadn't been there before. Doubt. The kings lied to you, Kael, Rhaegar said quietly. They lie to everyone. They're not protectors, they're parasites, and I'm going to kill them. Kael's sword wavered. I saw you fight. In the dungeon. I followed you once, did you know that? After the duel, after my power went crazy, I wanted to know who had done it. I followed you to the old kitchen, saw you go down, saw what came up. So Kael knew about Valther, about the prison, about everything. And you didn't tell the Inquisition. I didn't understand what I was seeing. I thought maybe the kings had sent you a test, a trial. He laughed bitterly. But they don't send trials like this. They send angels to murder children. I just watched an angel kill a 12-year-old girl because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The cathedral shook again. More angels poured through the crack. Rhaegar made a decision. If you want to help protect the survivors, get them out of the city into the countryside, hide them, keep them alive. Kael stared at him. And you? I'm going to close that crack. Rhaegar turned away. Try not to die, Prince. I might need you later. He vanished into the shadow, leaving Kael standing in the doorway with a sword in his hand and a world of doubt in his heart. Chapter 14, Starfall. The crack in the sky was a wound in reality itself, a tear through which the divine realm bled into the mortal world. Angels poured through it in an endless stream, their wings beating against the fabric of existence, their swords hungry for mortal blood. Rhaegar stood on the roof of the cathedral, the highest point in the academy, and faced it. Valther materialized beside him, his shadow form ragged from the fighting but still immense. You have a plan, little star. The system gave me 50,000 essence. I'm going to spend it. He opened the shop and scrolled through the options. Temporary powers, permanent skills, divine weaknesses, and at the bottom, grayed out until now, a single option that pulsed with red light. Ultimate skill, STARFALL. Cost 50,000 essence. Description: for one moment become the Scarlet Star. Strike the divine realm with the force of a falling star. Warning: this skill will consume all essence and may cause permanent damage to the user. Permanent damage. That could mean anything from losing a limb to losing his life. But as he watched more angels pour through the crack, as he heard the screams of the dying below, he knew there was no other choice. He purchased it. Skill ACQRED. STARFALL. Warning: skill activation will consume 100% of user's essence. Proceed. Rhaegar pressed yes. The world stopped. For one eternal moment everything froze. The angels in mid-flight, the flames consuming the cathedral, the screams of the dying. Even Valther, ancient and powerful, stood motionless, his shadow eyes wide with something that might have been awe. Rhaegar felt power building inside him, not the cold darkness of his shade blessing, not the hungry void of Valther's essence, but something else. Something that burned, something that remembered being a star, falling from the heavens, crashing into a world that would never be the same. He looked up at the crack, at the divine realm beyond, at the kings who watched from their thrones. And he fell, not downward, upward. He became light, became fire, became the Scarlet Star made flesh. He shot toward the crack, toward the kings, toward the heart of their power, and the angels who tried to stop him turned to ash at his passing. The kings saw him coming. They tried to close the crack to seal themselves away, but it was too late. He was through. He emerged in the divine realm, in the gathering place of the Pantheon, where the kings had assembled to watch his destruction. They stared at him, this mortal who had become a star, and for the first time in their eternal existence, they knew true fear. "Impossible," the King of War roared, raising his blade. "You cannot enter here." "I just did," Rhaegar said, and his voice was the voice of stars dying. "And I'm not leaving until some of you do." He struck. The King of War met him head-on, his blade of divine light clashing with the fire of the Scarlet Star. The impact shook the divine realm to its foundation, sending shockwaves through every plane of existence. Lesser kings fell, screaming, as the shockwave passed through. They fought king and star, and for the first time in eternity, a king bled in his own realm. Rhaegar's fire burned through divine armor, through divine flesh, through divine soul. The King of War screamed, a sound that had never been heard, and fell. But the cost was terrible. Rhaegar felt himself fatting, the starfire consuming him from within. He had minutes, maybe seconds, before he burned out completely. He looked at the remaining kings, huddled together like frightened children, and smiled. "This is just the beginning," he said. "I'll be back, we'll all be back, and when we return we'll finish what I started." He let the starfire take him, and he fell. Chapter 15. The Void's Bargain. He woke in darkness. Not the comforting darkness of shadows, not the living darkness of Valther's presence. Just darkness, empty, silent. "Am I dead?" he wondered. Not yet, a voice answered. Not Valther's, something older. Something that felt like the prison beneath the academy, but vaster. "You burned bright, little star. Too bright. But we're not done with you yet." "Who are you?" "We are what came before. What will come after. We are the darkness between stars, the silence between heartbeats, the void that waits for all light to fade. And we have been watching you." Rhaegar tried to move, but his body wasn't responding. He couldn't feel his arms, his legs, anything. "Your mortal form is damaged. The starfire consumed much of it, but we can help for a price." "What price?" "When you kill the kings, their essence must come to us. Every last drop. In return, we will rebuild your body, stronger than before, capable of holding the starfire without burning. A deal with the void, with whatever existed before the kings, before Valther, before everything." It was dangerous, foolish, probably suicidal, but Rhaegar had made deals with worse. "Fine, done, done." Light exploded behind his eyes, and he screamed. Chapter 16. The Gathering Storm. When he woke again, he was in a bed, a real bed, with clean sheets and soft pillows. Sunlight streamed through a window, and birds sang somewhere nearby. He sat up slowly, expecting pain. There was none. He looked at his hands. They were the same as before, but different, stronger. The scars from the divine realm were gone, replaced by faint lines that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. "About time you woke up." Timoth sat in a chair by the window, a book in his hand. He looked older, harder, the softness of youth burned away by whatever he had seen. "How long?" 3 weeks. We thought you were dead. Alara kept saying you'd wake up, but the rest of us." He shook his head. "A lot's happened." Rhaegar swung his legs out of bed. They held. "Tell me." "The academy is gone, destroyed in the battle. The Inquisition has been recalled to the capital. Something about the kings going silent. No one's heard from them since whatever you did up there. The kings were silent. That was good. That meant his attack had shaken them, made them retreat, buy time to recover. The survivors. We got maybe 300 out. Students, faculty, servants. They're scattered across the countryside, hiding in villages, waiting for, I don't know what." Timoth paused. "Kale helped. A lot. He organized the evacuation, fought off angels, saved dozens of people. He wants to talk to you." Rhaegar nodded. "Where is he?" "Outside, training the others." Rhaegar stood and walked to the window. Below, in a makeshift training ground, he saw them. Survivors, refugees, outcasts. They were practicing with swords, with bows, with whatever weapons they could find. And leading them, shouting encouragement, was Prince Kale. The golden boy had changed. His divine light was still there, but it was dimmer now, controlled. And in his eyes, Rhaegar saw something he hadn't seen before. "Purpose. The seeds you planted are growing," Valther's voice whispered in his mind. The entity was still with him, still connected, still watching. An army of outcasts led by a fallen prince, guided by a kingslayer. The kings won't know what hit them. Rhaegar smiled. It was a cold smile, the smile of a hunter who had just found his prey's trail. "Tell them I'm awake," he said to Timoth. "Tell them to get ready, we have work to do." Chapter 17. The Sun Eater. The weeks that followed were a blur of motion and purpose. Rhaegar threw himself into training, not just his body but his connection to the void that had rebuilt him. The entity, he had taken to calling it the deep dark in his mind, was always there, a presence at the edge of his consciousness, watching, waiting, occasionally whispering advice or warning. "You move like a mortal," the deep dark observed as Rhaegar sparred with Chaol in the morning light. "You think like a mortal, but you are no longer mortal. Your body is a vessel now, capable of holding power that would destroy any normal human. Yet you hold back. Why?" "Because if I don't hold back, I'll kill my ally," Rhaegar muttered, dodging Chaol's strike and countering with a blow that would have shattered the prince's ribs if he'd followed through. Chaol stumbled back, gasping, "You're holding back." "Always." The prince's eyes narrowed, but there was no resentment there. If anything, there was respect. In the weeks since the fall of the academy, Chaol had transformed from an arrogant prince into something Rhaegar hadn't expected, a true leader. He worked alongside the survivors, sharing their ration, tending their wounds, training them with a patience that seemed entirely at odds with his former self. "The kings haven't spoken," Chaol said now, lowering his sword. "Not a word, not a sign, not a blessing. The temples are empty, the priests are panicking, people are starting to ask questions." "Good, let them ask." Rhaegar sheathed his shadow blade. It was always with him now, a part of him in ways that felt both natural and strange. "Fear is the first step. Doubt is the second. After that comes rebellion. You really think we can win? A few hundred survivors against the entire Pantheon?" Rhaegar looked at him, really looked, and saw the doubt lurking beneath the newfound purpose. Chaol had seen kings die. He had seen Rhaegar become a star and strike the heavens. But he had also seen the endless tide of angels, the destruction of everything he'd known, the fragility of mortal life against divine power. "I don't know if we can win," Rhaegar admitted, "but I know we can't lose by trying. The alternative is to kneel and wait for them to decide our fate. I've done that once. Never again." Chaol nodded slowly. "Then tell me what to do." Chapter 18. The Desert Prison. The survivors had made their camp in a hidden valley, deep in the mountains that bordered the old academy land. It was defensible, remote, and according to Alara's visions, shielded from divine sight by some ancient magic that predated the Pantheon. Rhaegar suspected the deep dark had something to do with that, but he didn't ask. Some questions were better left unanswered. The camp had grown in the weeks since his awakening. Word was spreading, quietly, carefully, of a place where the king's reach couldn't touch. Refugees arrived in twos and threes, then in dozens, peasants whose villages had been destroyed by divine wrath, heretics who had fled the Inquisition, even a few former priests who had lost their faith when the angels started killing children. Timoth had become their quartermaster, organizing supplies with a meticulousness that would have been unthinkable in his sickly academy days. Alara was their seer, spending hours in trances, mapping the movements of divine forces across the continent. Vance, his brittle bones somehow stronger in the valley's strange atmosphere, led the scouts who patrolled the mountain passes. And Chaol trained the fighters. Hundreds of them now, armed with weapons forged in secret smithies, learning to move and fight and think like an army. But Rhaegar knew they weren't ready. Not yet. The kings were silent, but they weren't idle. They were gathering their strength, planning their response, waiting for the right moment to strike. When they did, it would be with all the fury of heaven. He needed more power, more allies, more time. The deep dark spoke again. "There are others like me. Not many. Most were destroyed or imprisoned when the kings rose to power. But some remain, hidden in the dark places of the world, waiting. If you could find them, free them, they would fight with us." "Where?" "I don't know. The millennia have blurred my memories. But the blind girl sees. Ask her to look for shadows that move against the light. She'll understand." Alara sat cross-legged in her tent, her blind eyes staring at nothing, her breathing slow and rhythmic. Rhaegar waited in silence, watching her face twitch as visions passed behind her useless eyes. Finally she spoke. "There are three, one to the north buried beneath a glacier. The kings sealed it there after the last ice age, thinking the cold would kill it. It didn't. And the others, one to the east in the desert. The sand hides it, protects it. The kings tried to dig it out once, but the desert fought back. They gave up after losing 1,000 angels." She paused, her brow furrowing. "The last one. It's close. Very close, under the city, under the capital itself." Rhaegar's blood ran cold. the capital, the seat of the Inquisition, the heart of divine power in the mortal world. If there was a prison there holding something like Valther, the kings know about it. They built the city on top of it. They wanted to watch it, guard it, make sure it never woke. But it's waking now. It feels you. It feels the deaths you've caused. It's calling to you. Rhaegar stood. Can you show me exactly where? Alara nodded slowly. In the palace, beneath the throne room, there's a vault that no one talks about, guarded by priests who never sleep. That's where it is. The palace, the throne room, the heart of the enemy's power. It was insane, suicidal, probably impossible. Rhaegar smiled. Chapter 19, Malachor. He left the next night, moving alone through the darkness. Valther had offered to accompany him, but Rhaegar refused. The entity was too conspicuous, too easily sensed by divine magic. For this mission, stealth was everything. The capital was 3 days' travel through mountain passes and forest trail. Rhaegar covered the distance in one, his rebuilt body never tiring, his shadow form allowing him to slip past patrols and settlements without detection. By the time the sun rose on the second day, he was standing on a hill overlooking the greatest city in the world. It was beautiful in its way. White towers rose toward the sky, their spires gleaming with gold that never tarnished. Temples dominated every district, their domes painted with images of the kings in their glory. And at the center, rising above everything, stood the royal palace, a massive complex of marble and magic that housed the king, the Inquisition, and the prison Alara had seen. Rhaegar waited for night. When darkness fell, he moved. The city's walls were high, but shadows pooled at their base, and Rhaegar flowed through them like water through cracks. The streets were empty. Curfew had been in effect since the kings fell silent, fear keeping citizens locked in their homes. Inquisitors patrolled in pairs, their divine magic flickering like torches in the dark. Rhaegar avoided them easily. His step had evolved since the starfall, carrying him not just through shadow but through the spaces between moments. He was there, then he wasn't, then he was somewhere else entirely. The Inquisitors never knew he passed. The palace loomed before him, its gates guarded by a full company of the royal guard. Not a challenge for him, but a delay. He circled the perimeter, looking for another way in, and found it in the sewers. The tunnels beneath the palace were ancient, predating the current structure by century. They stank of waste and death, but they were also empty, forgotten, perfect. Rhaegar moved through them until he found a maintenance shaft that led upward into the palace's lower level. He emerged in a storage room, filled with crates and barrels and the dust of neglect. Beyond the door he heard footsteps, guards walking a regular patrol. He waited, counting their steps, their timing, their rhythm. When they passed, he slipped out and moved deeper into the palace. Alara's directions were precise. Left at the third corridor, down the stairs, through the kitchen, right at the chapel. He followed them without hesitation, his shadow form making him invisible to the servants and guards who populated the palace even at this hour. The chapel was small, clearly private, used only by the royal family and their closest advisors. But behind the altar, hidden by a tapestry, was a door. Not marked, not guarded, but Rhaegar felt the magic radiating from it. Divine wards, layered thick enough to stop an army. He studied them, letting the system analyze their structure. Simple, really, designed to keep out those who carried divine blessings, who worshipped the kings, who had any connection to the Pantheon. But Rhaegar's power came from elsewhere, from the void, from the stars, from the deaths of kings. He reached out and touched the door. The wards flared, then died. He stepped through. The stairs descended forever, or so it seemed. Rhaegar lost track of time as he walked downward, the darkness so complete that even his shadow-born eyes struggled to pierce it. The air grew cold, then colder, until each breath was a cloud of frost. The walls changed from stone to something else, smooth, dark, organic, like the inside of a living thing. "You're close," the deep dark whispered. "I can feel it. One of my siblings, ancient, powerful, angry." The stairs ended at last, opening into a vast chamber. At its center, chained to the floor with links of pure light, was a creature that defied description. It was massive, easily the size of the cathedral where Rhaegar had first faced the king. Its form shifted constantly, now a mountain of shadow, now a forest of grasping tendrils, now a single enormous eye that stared at Rhaegar with ancient intelligence. The chains bound it, held it, but barely. Every link glowed with the combined power of a dozen kings, and even then the creature strained against them. A voice boomed in Rhaegar's mind. Another little mortal come to gawk at the prisoner. Have you brought me food, little mortal? Have you brought me light to consume? I've brought you freedom, Rhaegar said calmly, if you want it. The creature's eye narrowed. Freedom. No mortal can break these chains. They were forged by the Pantheon in their full power. They have held me for 10,000 years. 10,000 years is a long time. The kings aren't what they used to be. I've killed 2 of them already. More will follow. Silence, then something that might have been laughter. You, a mortal, you've killed kings. King of hunters, king of war, a kingling in a forest. The king of war screamed when he died. Did you know they could scream? I didn't. The creature's form shifted, contracting, becoming more focused. The eye moved closer, studying. I see it now. The starfire in your bones, the void in your soul. You've made deals with dangerous things, little mortal. I have, and I'll make another with you if you're interested. What do you want? Fight with me. When the time comes, stand with us against the kings. Help us tear down their thrones and end their reign. And in return, Rhaegar met the creature's gaze without flinching. Freedom, now. And when the war is over, you can go wherever you want, do whatever you want. No chains, no prison, no kings watching your every move. The creature considered this. The chains hummed, their light pulsing, as if they sensed the negotiation and didn't like it. The kings will never let me go. Even if you kill them, their magic remains. These chains will hold until the end of time. Then I'll break them. Rhaegar drew his shadow blade. Show me where to strike. The creature's eye widened. You can't be serious. Those chains are made of pure divine essence. One touch and you'll be. Rhaegar struck. The blade met the chain, and the world exploded. When the light faded, Rhaegar was on his knees, his hands smoking, his body screaming. But the chain was broken. Its 2 ends lay on the floor, their light flickering and dying. The creature stared. Then slowly it began to laugh. A deep, rumbling sound that shook the chamber and sent dust raining from above. You did it. You actually did it. 1 down, Rhaegar gasped. 11 to go. The creature flexed and the remaining chains groaned. One by one, Rhaegar struck them, each blow costing him more than the last. By the time the final chain fell, he could barely stand, his vision swimming, his body on the verge of collapse. The creature rose. Freed from its bonds, it expanded, filling the chamber, pushing against the walls, the ceiling, the very fabric of reality. It was immense, beautiful, terrible, and it was free. I am called Malachor, it said, its voice now gentle, almost reverent, and I owe you a debt that can never be repaid. Repay it by fighting, Rhaegar said. That's all I ask. Malachor's form shifted, contracting until it stood before him as a humanoid figure of living shadow, not unlike Valther but darker, deeper, more ancient. I will fight, but not yet. First, you need to recover, and we need to find the others. There are more of us scattered across the world. If we gather them all, the kings won't stand a chance. Rhaegar nodded, too exhausted to speak. Malachor extended a shadow hand and helped him to his feet. Come, little star, let's go home. Chapter 20, The Dreamer. The valley stirred with a new energy in the days that followed Malachor's arrival. The ancient entity kept to the shadows, rarely showing himself to the refugees, but his presence was felt by everyone. The air seemed heavier, the darkness deeper, and even those who couldn't sense magic knew that something had changed. Rhaegar recovered quickly, faster than any mortal should. The void in his bones knitted flesh and sinew with supernatural speed, and by the 3rd day he was back on his feet, training harder than before. The system had grown silent since the starfall, its interface reduced to a faint pulse at the edge of his vision, but he could feel it waiting, gathering strength for the battles ahead. Chaol found him at dawn, shadow blade in hand, moving through forms that would have killed any normal fighter. The prince watched in silence for a long moment before speaking. The scouts report movement. Divine forces are gathering at the old academy site. Thousands of them. Rhaegar didn't stop his practice. They're searching for us. They know we're out here somewhere, but they don't know where. The valley's protection is holding. For now. But Alara had a vision last night. She said the kings are growing impatient. They're going to start destroying villages, cities, anyone they think might be hiding us. They'll kill millions to find one man. Rhaegar stopped, his blade dissolving into shadow. She saw this. Clearly, the King of Justice is leading the purge. He's convinced that if they make an example of enough innocents, someone will betray you to save themselves. The logic was sound. In Rhaegar's past life, he had seen the Inquisition use the same tactics, burning entire villages to flush out a single heretic. The kings had taught them well. Then we need to move faster, Rhaegar said. The northern prison, the glacier, how long to get there? Weeks, even with Malakar's help. The mountains are treacherous this time of year, and the divine forces are watching the passes. Rhaegar considered this. Weeks was too long. In weeks, the kings could destroy half the continent. He needed a faster way. There is a way, the deep dark whispered, but you won't like it. Tell me. The void between spaces. I could open a path directly to the glacier, but it would require fuel, life force. The more you take, the faster and farther you can travel. You're talking about killing. I'm talking about sacrifice. The void doesn't create energy, it consumes it. If you want to move through it, you have to feed it. The question is, what are you willing to pay? Rhaegar stood in silence, the weight of the choice pressing down on him. He had killed kings. He had killed angels, but innocent mortals. That was a line he had never crossed, even in his past life as an assassin. He killed targets, not bystanders. But if he didn't act, millions would die anyway. The kings would slaughter them without hesitation. You're thinking like a mortal, Deep Dark observed. Mortals worry about the few to save the many. The void doesn't make such distinctions. Life is life. Energy is energy. The question isn't whether you'll take it, it's whether you'll take it yourself or let the kings take it. Rhaegar's jaw tightened. There has to be another way. There is. Find the desert prison first. It's closer, and the journey doesn't require void travel. Free that one, and together you might be strong enough to face the kings directly, without needing to sacrifice anyone. The desert. Alara had mentioned it, an entity buried beneath the sands, protected by the desert itself. If they could free it, they would have 3 ancient beings on their side. 3 against the Pantheon. Still impossible odds, but better than 2. Kale, Rhaegar said sharply. Gather the leadership, we're changing plans. Chapter 21. The Sun Eater rises. The desert was a week's journey from the valley, but with Malakar's help, Rhaegar covered the distance in a single night. The entity bent space around them, folding the world until mountains became hills and forests became fields. By dawn, they stood at the edge of an endless sea of sand. I can go no further, Malakar said, his shadow form flickering in the rising sun. The desert's magic rejects me. It remembers that I am like the one imprisoned, and it fears what I might do if I reach him. Then wait here. If I'm not back in 3 days, return to the valley and tell them to prepare for the worst. You'll be back, the void protects you. Malakar paused, but be careful, little star. The Sun Eater is not like Valther or me. We were imprisoned by the kings. He was imprisoned by the universe itself. He is different. Rhaegar nodded and stepped into the desert. The sand swallowed him, the heat rising in waves that would have killed any normal human. But Rhaegar's body wasn't normal anymore. The void in his bones regulated his temperature, kept him cool even as the sun blazed overhead. He walked for hours, then days, his shadow blade serving as a compass, pointing always toward the prison. On the 3rd day, the desert spoke to him, not in words but in sensation. The sand beneath his feet shifted, forming patterns that seemed almost like writing. The wind carried whispers that faded when he tried to listen, and in the distance he saw shapes, buildings perhaps, or ruins, that vanished when he looked directly at them. You are close, the Deep Dark whispered. The prison is near, but so is the desert's guardian. Rhaegar stopped. Guardian. Every prison has a jailer. The desert's jailer is a creature of sand and wind, born from the entity's own power. It has guarded this place for 10,000 years, killing anything that approaches. It will not be fooled by your void-touched body. It will sense you as a threat. Then I'll have to kill it. You can't. It's not alive. It's a construct, a manifestation of the desert's will. You can destroy its form, but it will reform. The only way past it is to convince it that you're not a threat. Rhaegar considered this. Convince a creature of sand and wind, a being that had killed thousands over millennia, that he meant no harm. It seemed impossible, but he had done impossible things before. He walked on. The guardian found him at sunset. It rose from the sand without warning, a towering figure of swirling grains and howling wind. Its shape was vaguely humanoid, but constantly shifting, arms becoming wings becoming claws. and at its center, where a heart should be, a single eye of compressed crystal watched him with ancient suspicion. Halt, it boomed, its voice the sound of sandstorm. No mortal passes. Rhaegar stopped and raised his empty hands. I'm not here to harm the prisoner. I'm here to free him. The eye narrowed. Free. You speak of freedom as if it were a gift. The prisoner was condemned by the universe itself. His freedom would mean the end of WRLDS. Maybe, but the kings who imprisoned him are killing millions as we speak. If he helps us stop them, isn't that worth the risk? The kings are parasites. But the Sun Eater is a predator. You trade one evil for another. Rhaegar shook his head. I'm not trading, I'm using. When the kings are dead, I'll deal with him. But right now, he's the only weapon we have that can match them. The Guardian was silent for a long moment. The sand around them shifted, patterns forming and dissolving in the dying light. You carry the void, it said finally. The deep dark has marked you. I remember the deep dark. It was old when the Sun Eater was young. Then you know I'm not lying. The void wants the kings dead as much as I do. The void wants all things dead. It is the final darkness, the end of everything. You are its tool, not its ally. Maybe, but I'm a tool that chooses its own path. And right now, that path leads past you. The Guardian's eye studied him for a long, terrible moment. Then slowly, it stepped aside. Pass, little star. But remember, the Sun Eater is not your friend. He is not your ally. He is a force of nature, and nature cares nothing for mortal causes. Rhaegar walked past it, toward the prison. The entrance was a hole in the world. Not literally, but almost. The sand for 100 yards in every direction had been replaced by smooth, black stone, and at its center, a staircase descended into darkness. The air here was cold, despite the desert heat, and Rhaegar's breath misted as he approached. He descended. The stairs went down for what felt like miles, spiraling into the earth until the light from above was nothing but a memory. But Rhaegar didn't need light. The darkness was his home now, his element, his power. He walked through it like a fish through water. At the bottom, he found the prison. It wasn't a cell or a cage. It was a room, vast and empty, with walls of polished obsidian that reflected nothing. And at its center, floating in the air, was a sphere of pure light. But not the gentle light of the sun. This light was harsh, burning, hungry. It pulsed with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, and as Rhaegar watched, it began to change. The sphere expanded, contracted, expanded. Shapes formed within it. Eyes, mouths, hands, all reaching, grasping, wanting. And then, suddenly, it was gone, replaced by a figure that stood before him as if it had always been there. He was beautiful in the way that stars were beautiful. Tall and golden, with hair that seemed to glow and eyes that held the fire of 1,000 suns. He wore robes of woven light, and when he smiled, the room grew brighter. A mortal, he said, his voice like the crackle of solar flames. It's been so long since I've seen a mortal. The kings used to send them heroes, they called them, champion. They thought mortal courage could do what divine power could not. They were wrong, of course. They always are. Rhaegar met his gaze without flinching. I'm not a hero. I'm not a champion. I'm an assassin, and I've come to offer you. The Sun Eater laughed, and the sound shook the room. A deal. Little mortal, I have eaten stars. I have consumed galaxies. What could you possibly offer me? Freedom, and a chance to kill the kings who put you here. The laughter stopped. The light in the room dimmed just slightly as the Sun Eater's eyes narrowed. The kings, those petty parasites who stole my domain and locked me in this hole. You would help me kill them. I've already killed 2. The king of hunters and the king of war. More will follow. Interest flickered in those burning eyes. You've killed kings. You a mortal. With help, and with power you don't understand. Rhaegar extended his hand, and the void within him responded, darkness pooling in his palm. The deep dark chose me. It rebuilt me, and it wants the kings dead as much as I do. The Sun Eater stared at the darkness in Rhaegar's hand, and for the first time something like caution entered his expression. The deep dark, I remember it. It was old when I was young. It will consume everything eventually, including you. Eventually, but not today. Today it's helping me free you. Are you interested or not? A long pause. Then slowly the Sun Eater smiled again. I am interested, little mortal, very interested. But before I agree to anything, I want to see something. What? I want to see if you're worthy. The kings imprisoned me with more than chains. They bound me with a spell that only the truly powerful can break. If you can break it, I'll fight with you. If you can't, well, I'll add your light to my own." Rhaegar didn't hesitate. "Show me." The Sun Eater gestured, and the room changed. Suddenly they were standing in a void, not the comforting darkness of the deep dark, but an empty, sterile nothing. And in the center of this nothing, a single chain hung from nowhere, its links glowing with the combined power of every king in the Pantheon. "Break it," the Sun Eater challenged. "Break it and I'm yours." Rhaegar approached the chain. It was massive, each link the size of his body, and the power radiating from it was immense. He could feel the king's wills pressing against him, their hatred, their fear, their determination to keep this creature imprisoned forever. He drew his shadow blade. The void within him surged, feeding into the weapon, making it darker, sharper, more real. He raised it above his head and brought it down with all his strength. The blade met the chain, and the chain held. Rhaegar staggered back, his arm numb from the impact. The chain hadn't even scratched. The king's magic was too strong, too layered, too ancient. "Pathetic," the Sun Eater sneered. "I thought you were different, I thought." "Shut up." Rhaegar focused, reaching deeper into the void. The deep dark responded, but slowly, reluctantly. It didn't want to give him more power. It wanted him to fail, to prove that he needed it, to bind him closer. But Rhaegar didn't need more power. He needed different power. He thought of the starfall, the moment when he had become light itself and struck the heavens. He thought of the king's faces when they saw him coming, the fear in their eternal eyes. He thought of the axe falling, the betrayal, the death that had started all of this. And he reached for that power again. The starfire ignited in his bones, burning through the void, through his flesh, through everything. He screamed as it consumed him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He raised his blade again, and this time it blazed with the light of a dying star. He struck. The chain shattered. Light exploded outward, and the void room collapsed, and Rhaegar fell to his knees in the obsidian chamber, gasping, smoking, barely conscious. The Sun Eater stood over him, his burning eyes wide with something that might have been awe. You actually did it. You broke the Pantheon's strongest prison with nothing but mortal will and stolen fire." He knelt, bringing himself to Rhaegar's level. "What are you, little mortal? What are you really?" Rhaegar looked up at him, his vision swimming, his body screaming. "I'm the one who's going to kill the kings, with or without you, your choice." The Sun Eater studied him for a long moment. Then slowly he smiled. "With, I think. Definitely with. Watching you fight is going to be entertaining." He extended a hand of woven light, and Rhaegar took it. Chapter 22. The Glacier's Secret. They emerged from the desert together, the Sun Eater walking beside Rhaegar as if he had always been there. Malachor saw them coming and actually stepped back, his ancient form flickering with something that might have been fear. "Sun Eater," he breathed, "you're free." Malachor still lurking in shadows, "I see. Some things never change." The Sun Eater's gaze swept over him, then over the desert beyond. "The kings will feel this. They'll know I'm loose. They'll come." "Let them," Rhaegar said. "We'll be ready." "Will we?" The Sun Eater turned to him. "I've seen your army, little mortal. A few hundred refugees and 2 ancient entities who have spent millennia in prison. That's not an army. That's a sacrifice. It's a start, and we're not done yet. There's one more prison, the Glacier. Free that one and we'll have 4. 4 against the Pantheon. Still impossible odds." "Nothing's impossible." Rhaegar met his burning gaze. "I've killed 2 kings already. I can kill more." The Sun Eater laughed, a genuine laugh this time, full of warmth and light. "I like you, little mortal. I like you a lot. Very well. Let's go find this glacier prison, and then let's go kill some kings." They turned away from the desert and walked toward the mountains. 3 ancient powers and 1 mortal who had become something more. Behind them the desert stirred, its guardian watching them go. And in the heavens above, the kings gathered once more, their fear growing with each passing moment. The Scarlet Star was rising, and this time it brought the sun with it. Chapter 23. The Dreamer Awakens. The journey north was different from the journey into the desert. For one, Rhaegar wasn't alone. The Sun Eater walked beside him, his radiant form dimmed to something almost mortal, though his eyes still blazed with the fire of consumed stars. Malachor followed at a distance, his shadow form flickering with unease in the presence of his ancient sibling. And Valthar, connected through the void, watched from the edges of Rhaegar's consciousness, offering advice and warnings in equal measure. The Glacier Prison is the oldest, Valthor explained as they crossed the mountain passes. It was the first they built, back when the kings were still learning their power. They made mistakes with that one, mistakes they later tried to correct with Malakar's prison and the Sun Eater. But the glacier prison remained, imperfect but effective. What kind of mistakes? Rhaegar asked. The entity within is not like us. It was never fully imprisoned. The kings couldn't figure out how, so they buried it under ice and hoped it would sleep forever. It hasn't. It's been awake for millennia, waiting, watching, growing stronger. When we free it, we may not like what we find. Rhaegar filed that information away. Another variable, another unknown. But he had learned to work with unknowns. They were the only constants in his life now. The glacier rose before them on the 5th day, a wall of ancient ice that stretched across the horizon like the edge of the world. The temperature had dropped steadily as they climbed, until even Rhaegar's void-touched body felt the cold seeping into his bone. The Sun Eater, paradoxically, seemed unaffected. His inner fire burned hot enough to keep the ice at bay, though he made no move to melt their path. "It's here," Malakar said, his voice hushed. "Beneath the ice. I can feel it dreaming." "Then let's wake it up." Rhaegar approached the glacier and placed his palm against the ice. The void within him stirred, reaching out, searching for the presence below. He felt it almost immediately, a pulse of awareness, ancient and vast, turning toward him like a sleeping giant disturbed by a fly. "Who dares?" The voice was slow, thick with the weight of millennia. "Who disturbs the dreamer's rest?" "My name is Rhaegar. I've come to free you." Silence. Then something that might have been laughter, though it sounded more like ice cracking. "Free me, child. I have never been imprisoned. I chose this place. I chose to sleep. The kings thought they trapped me, but they were wrong. I stayed because I wanted to. Because the world outside was loud and bright and full of things I didn't want to see." Rhaegar frowned. This was unexpected. "Then why stay? The kings are killing millions. They need to be stopped. Let them kill. Let them burn. The world will recover. It always does. And when the noise fades, I will wake and walk among the ruins and remember what it was like before the parasites came. You can't just. I can do whatever I wish. I am older than the kings, older than the void, older than the stars themselves. I have watched universes born and die. A few million mortals are nothing to me." Rhaegar stepped back, his mind racing. The entity in the glacier wasn't a prisoner. It was a bystander, a witness, something that had chosen to sleep through the rise of the Pantheon rather than fight, and it had no interest in helping. But maybe he could change that. "You say you've watched universes born and die. Then you've seen what happens when parasites grow too powerful. They consume everything. They don't leave ruins, they leave nothing. The kings aren't just killing mortals. They're killing the world. They're draining its magic, its life, its future. If they aren't stopped, there won't be any ruins for you to walk through. There won't be anything at all." Another long silence. The ice beneath his hand seemed to pulse, as if the entity was considering his word. "You speak with passion, child, but passion is not truth. Show me. Show me what the kings have done and I will decide." Rhaegar closed his eyes and reached into his memory. He showed the entity the execution block, the axe falling, the betrayal. He showed the academy, the failures, the dungeon crawl. He showed the angels killing children, the cathedral burning, the screams of the dying. He showed the kings' faces as they watched, their cold indifference, their hunger for worship and fear. And finally, he showed the starfall, his own transformation, the moment he became light and struck the heavens, the terror in the kings' eyes as they realized they could bleed. The entity absorbed it all in silence. When Rhaegar opened his eyes, the glacier was cracking. "I see," the voice said, and now it was different, sharper, more focused, more present. "I see what they've become. When I went asleep, they were children playing at divinity, learning their power. I thought they would grow out of it, find wisdom, become something better. Instead, they became worse. Much worse." The ice split, a chasm opening at Rhaegar's feet. From within, light emerged. Not the burning light of the Sun Eater, but something softer, older, like the first light of dawn on a world just born. "I will help you, child. Not because I care about your war, but because I care about what the kings have forgotten. They have forgotten that they were once mortal. They have forgotten that power is a responsibility, not a right. They have forgotten that the universe does not revolve around them." A figure rose from the chasm. It was humanoid, but barely, more a suggestion of form than form itself, its edges soft and blurred, as if it existed slightly out of focus. Its face, when it turned to Rhaegar, held features that shifted and changed, never settling, always becoming. I am called the Dreamer, and I have slept too long. Chapter 24, The Final Battle. The valley was buzzing with activity when they returned. Word had spread through Alara's visions, through the network of refugees, through the whispers that carried on the wind. The kings were coming. The final battle was near, and everyone who had chosen to fight needed to be ready. Kale met them at the valley's entrance, his face grim but determined. The scouts report movement. Divine forces are gathering at the old academy site. Thousands of angels plus avatars of the major kings. They'll be here within days. Days, Rhaegar repeated. Good, that gives us time. Time for what? We have maybe 500 fighters, most of them barely trained, against thousands of angels and kings themselves. Kale shook his head. Rhaegar, I believe in you, I do, but this is suicide. No, this is war. Rhaegar looked past him at the camp spread across the valley floor. Refugees training with weapons they'd never held before. Children learning to move in formation. Old men and women sharpening blades and praying to kings they no longer believed in. They chose to fight. That means something. It means they're desperate, the Sun Eater observed. Desperation can be a weapon if wielded correctly. Then we'll wield it. Rhaegar turned to the four entities. I need you to train them, not to fight angels, they can't win that fight, but to survive, to delay, to create openings. When the kings come, you four will be the ones engaging them directly. The mortals will handle the angels. Valther nodded slowly. A sound strategy. The mortals buy us time, we kill the kings, but it relies on the mortals surviving long enough. They will. They're fighting for their homes, their families, their futures. That's a powerful motivator. The days that followed were the most intense of Rhaegar's life. He trained with the refugees from dawn until dusk, teaching them everything he knew about combat, survival, and killing. The entities worked with the most promising fighters, imbuing them with fragments of their power, creating a core of warriors who could actually threaten angels. Kale became Rhaegar's second-in-command, organizing the camp with the efficiency of a born leader. Timoth managed supplies, ensuring that everyone had water and weapons. Alara spent her days in trance, mapping the enemy's movements and warning of approaching threats. Vance led the scouts, his brittle bones now reinforced by a touch of Malakar's shadow stuff. And Rhaegar prepared. He spent his nights in meditation, reaching into the void, drawing on its power. The deep dark was always there, watching, waiting, occasionally offering advice. It wanted the kings dead as much as he did, but he knew it was playing a longer game. When the war was over, when the kings were gone, the void would still be there, and it would want more. But that was a problem for another day. On the fifth night, Alara came to him with a vision. They're coming, she said quietly. Tomorrow at dawn. The King of Justice leads them with the King of Mercy at his side. They've brought every angel they have, tens of thousands, and they're not alone. Rhaegar's eyes narrowed. Who else? The King of Wisdom. He's been watching, planning, waiting. He's the one who figured out where we are. He's the one who convinced the others to attack now before we can gather more power. She paused, her blind eyes seeming to look through. He knows about the entities. He knows about you, and he's afraid. That's why he's coming himself. A king afraid was a king who made mistakes. Rhaegar filed that information away. Tomorrow at dawn, he repeated. Then we'll be ready. Dawn came slowly, the sun creeping over the mountains with apparent reluctance, as if it too feared what was about to happen. Rhaegar stood at the valley's entrance. The four entities gathered around him like shadows made flesh. Behind them, the refugees waited in formation, their weapons ready, their faces set with determination. The sky darkened as the divine host approached. Angels filled the heavens, their wings blotting out the sun, their swords blazing with holy fire. At their head, three figures descended, the King of Justice armored and stern, the King of Mercy robed and sorrowful, and the King of Wisdom cloaked and watchful. Rhaegar, Justice's voice boomed, shaking the mountain. You are charged with heresy, blasphemy, and the murder of divine being. Surrender now, and those who follow you will be spared. Resist, and they will be destroyed. Rhaegar stepped forward, alone, facing the army of heaven. Behind him, he felt the entities gathering their power, the refugees steadying their nerves, the valley holding its breath. I've been charged before, he called back. "The last time I was executed for a crime I didn't commit. The kings watched and did nothing. So forgive me if I don't trust your promises." "You dare." "I dare a lot of things." Rhaegar drew his shadow blade and the void within him surged. "I dare to fight. I dare to kill kings. And I dare to win." The King of Wisdom stepped forward, his hood falling back to reveal a face that was calm, thoughtful, utterly without anger. "Rhaegar, I have watched you since your birth. I saw your potential, your power, your pain. I knew you would become something dangerous. I tried to warn the others, but they wouldn't listen. They never do. Then you're as guilty as they are. Perhaps, but guilt is irrelevant now. What matters is what happens next. You have gathered allies, ancient beings who should have stayed imprisoned. You have built an army from refugees and outcasts. You have become the Scarlet Star of prophecy. But prophecy is not destiny. It is possibility, and possibilities can be changed. Are you offering me a deal? I am offering you a choice. Surrender, and I will ensure your followers are treated with mercy. They will be exiled, not executed. They will live out their lives in peace, far from the divine realms. You, however, will be imprisoned, not killed, not tortured, simply contained. The threat you pose is too great to ignore, but your death would make you a martyr. I would avoid that if possible." Rhaegar considered this. It was a better offer than he'd expected. Mercy from the King of Mercy, perhaps, or a trap from the King of Wisdom. Hard to tell. He looked back at the valley, at the refugees who had chosen to follow him. Timoth, pale but steady. Alara, blind but seeing more than anyone. Kale, the golden prince who had become something more. And the entities, Valther, Malachor, the Sun-Eater, the Dreamer, waiting for his command. He turned back to Wisdom. "No." The king's expression didn't change. "No. No, I don't trust you. I don't trust any of you. You've had millennia to show mercy, to be just, to be wise. Instead, you built a system that crushes the weak and elevates the strong. You let the Inquisition torture innocents. You let angels kill children. You watched as I was executed for a crime I didn't commit, and you did nothing. We did nothing because you were nothing." Justice roared. "A single mortal life is meaningless in the grand scheme. That's where you're wrong." Rhaegar raised his blade, and the void answered. Darkness swirled around him, deeper than any shadow, colder than any ice. "Every mortal life matters. Every death you've caused, every prayer you've ignored, every hope you've crushed, it all matters. And today, you're going to pay for it." He leaped. Chapter 25. The Death of Justice. The battle erupted instantly, chaos swallowing order as mortal and divine clashed. Rhaegar's blade found Justice's throat before the king could react, but Justice was ancient, powerful, and the wound closed almost instantly. He counterattacked with a hammer of divine light that would have shattered mountains, and Rhaegar barely dodged. Around them, the angels descended on the valley, and the refugees met them with steel and shadow. Kale led the defense, his diminished divine light still bright enough to wound the heavenly host. Timoth fought with desperate courage, his rusted sword finding gaps in angelic armor. Alara directed from the rear, her visions warning of attacks before they came. The entities engaged the kings. Valther wrapped mercy in shadow, consuming the king's light even as mercy wept and prayed. Malachor tore through angel ranks, his ancient power shredding wings and flesh with the Sun-Eater faced Wisdom directly, his burning form clashing with the king's cool intellect in a battle that lit the sky. And the Dreamer simply watched, his presence alone enough to slow time, to make angels hesitate, to give mortals the extra seconds they needed to survive. Rhaegar focused on Justice. They fought across the valley, through the mountains, into the sky itself. Justice's hammer against Rhaegar's blade, divine light against void darkness, eternity against a mortal who refused to stay dead. "You cannot win," Justice roared, his blows shaking reality. "I am justice itself. I am the balance, I am." "You're a murderer with a fancy title." Rhaegar's blade found the crack in Justice's armor, the tiny flaw that millennia of self-righteousness had created. He pushed, and the blade sank deep. Justice screamed. The sound echoed across the battlefield, and for a moment everyone, mortal and angel alike, froze. They had heard kings scream before when Rhaegar killed the king of war. But this was different. This was justice, the embodiment of divine order, the foundation of the Pantheon's rule. If he could fall, anyone could. Rhaegar twisted the blade. Justice exploded into light, and the battle shifted. Chapter 26. The Fall of Wisdom. Mercy fell next, weeping even as Valther consumed him. The King of Mercy had never wanted to fight, had always argued for compassion and forgiveness. But in the end, he was still a king, still part of the system, still guilty by association. Valther absorbed his essence and grew stronger, his shadow form solidifying into something almost physical. Wisdom fought longer. The Sun Eater was ancient, powerful, but wisdom was clever. He dodged and weaved, using the battlefield as a shield, forcing the Sun Eater to hold back lest he kill mortals along with kings. But Rhaegar saw the pattern, saw the weakness, and intervened. He appeared behind Wisdom, his blade already swinging. The king turned, surprised, and for one eternal moment their eyes met. Wisdom's gaze held no fear, no anger, only a deep, profound sadness. "You could have been great," he said quietly. "You could have been one of us. I'd rather be mortal." The blade fell. Wisdom crumbled into light, and the last of the three kings was gone. Chapter 27. The Gift of Freedom. The angels fled. Without their leaders, without the divine presence that had driven them, they broke and scattered across the sky, pursued by shadows and fire and the laughter of ancient entity. The valley was littered with their bodies, with the bodies of mortals who had given everything for this moment. Rhaegar stood in the center of it all, his blade dripping with divine essence, his body screaming with exhaustion. The void within him pulsed hungrily, wanting more, wanting to consume the fallen king's power. But he held it back. Not yet. First, he needed to see. He walked through the battlefield, stepping over bodies, ignoring the groans of the wounded. He found Chaol leaning against a rock, his golden eyes dim but alive. He found Timoth kneeling beside Alara, who had collapsed from the strain of her vision. He found Vance and his scouts, bloodied but victorious. And he found the entities. Valther stood tall, his form more solid than ever, his eyes blazing with consumed light. Malachor had grown, his shadow stuff expanding to cover half the valley. The Sun Eater burned brighter than before, his fire almost too bright to look at. And the dreamer was unchained, his soft light watching everything with ancient patience. "It's done," Valther said. "The kings who came are dead. The Pantheon is broken." "Not broken," Rhaegar corrected. "Weakened. There are still more kings out there, hiding in their realms, waiting to see what happens next. We need to finish this." "Agreed." The Sun Eater stepped forward, "But not today. Today we rest. Today we mourn. Today we remember why we fought." Rhaegar wanted to argue, wanted to push on, wanted to end it now. But he looked at the refugees, at the bodies of the fallen, at the exhaustion in every face, and he knew the Sun Eater was right. "Tomorrow," he said, "tomorrow we plan the final assault. Today we rest." That night the valley held a funeral. They burned the bodies of the fallen on pyres that lit the sky, their smoke rising toward stars that no longer held kings. The survivors gathered in circle, sharing stories, sharing grief, sharing hope. It was the first time in weeks that anyone had allowed themselves to feel something other than fear. Rhaegar sat apart, watching. The void pulsed within him, hungry, impatient, but he ignored it. He had learned to live with the hunger, to control it rather than let it control him. Chaol found him there, sitting on a rock overlooking the valley. "You did it," the prince said quietly. "You actually did it. We did it, all of us." Rhaegar looked at him. "You fought well today, better than any king." Chaol laughed bitterly. "I was raised to be a king, trained to be a king, worshipped like a king, and look where that got me." He shook his head. "I'm glad I followed you. I'm glad I chose this path, even though it led here. To this valley, this battle, this blood. Especially because it led here." Chaol met his gaze. "For the first time in my life I know what I'm fighting for. Not worship, not power, not glory, just people, mortals. The ones the kings forgot." Rhaegar nodded slowly. He understood. He had felt the same way once a long time ago. They sat in silence, watching the pyres burn, listening to the distant sounds of mourning and celebration. Tomorrow they would plan. Tomorrow they would prepare. Tomorrow they would march on the divine realm and finish what they started. But tonight they would rest. And in the morning, the Scarlet Star would rise again. Chapter 28. The King of Creation. The morning after the battle dawned gray and somber, as if the sky itself mourned the dead. Rhaegar stood at the edge of the valley, watching the survivors emerge from their tents and shelters, their faces etched with a mixture of grief and grim determination. They had won a battle, yes, but everyone knew the war was far from over. Chaol found him there, as he always did now. The prince had become Rhaegar's shadow, his second in command, his conscience when the void's hunger grew too loud. He stood silently for a long moment before speaking. We've counted the dead, 217. Another 100 wounded too badly to fight again. Rhaegar nodded slowly. Nearly a third of their force gone in a single day. The angels had fought ferociously, even after their kings fell. It had taken the entity's full power to break them. The ones who can still fight, maybe 300, plus the entity. It's not enough for a full assault on the divine realm. No, Rhaegar agreed. It's not, which is why we're not going to assault the divine realm. Kale blinked. What, then what's the plan? Rhaegar turned to face him, and Kale was struck by how much he had changed. The boy who had entered the academy as a failure, cursed with a worthless blessing, was gone. In his place stood something else, a being of shadow and starfear, ancient and young at once, his eyes holding depths that made even the bravest look away. The kings are afraid, Rhaegar said. We killed 3 of their strongest in a single day. The rest are hiding in their realms, fortifying, waiting. They won't come out to fight us. They'll wait for us to come to them, and when we do, they'll have every trap, every defense, every weapon they've accumulated over millennia ready. So we don't go to them, we make them come to us. Exactly, Rhaegar gestured at the valley. This place is protected. The entities feel it, some ancient magic that predates the kings. If we can lure the remaining Pantheon here, we fight on ground of our choosing with all our advantages. How do we lure them? They're not stupid, they won't walk into a trap. No, but they are proud. And they are afraid. Fear and pride make people do stupid things. Rhaegar's lips curved into a cold smile. We're going to give them something they can't ignore. We're going to give them a target so tempting, so infuriating, that they'll have no choice but to come. Kale's eyes widened. You're going to use yourself as bait. I'm the Scarlet Star. I'm the one who killed their brothers. I'm the symbol of everything they fear. If I stand in an open field and challenge them, they'll come. They won't be able to help themselves. It's suicide. Probably, but I've survived suicide before. Rhaegar's smile faded. And I won't be alone. The entities will be with me. And so will you if you're willing. Kale was silent for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. I'm willing. I've come this far. I'm not stopping now. The council that followed was tense. The entities argued among themselves, each proposing different strategies, different approaches. Valther wanted to strike immediately while the kings were still reeling. Malachar advocated for patience, for building their strength over months or years. The Sun Eater, true to his nature, wanted to burn everything and let the survivors sort themselves out. The Dreamer simply watched, his ancient eyes missing nothing. In the end, Rhaegar's plan won out. Not because it was the best, everyone knew it was reckless, but because it was the only one that might work before the kings regrouped and struck first. 3 days, Rhaegar announced. In 3 days, I'll stand in the valley's center and challenge the Pantheon. The entities will position themselves around me, hidden, waiting. The army will hold the perimeter, keeping the angels at bay while we focus on the kings themselves. And if more kings come than we can handle, Timoth asked quietly, then we die. But we die fighting, which is more than most mortals get. Timoth nodded, accepting this with the calm that had grown in him over the months. He was no longer the sickly boy from the remedial class. He was a soldier, a leader, a survivor. Then we'd better make these 3 days count. Chapter 29, The Final Challenge. The 3rd day dawned clear and cold, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed almost mocking in its beauty. Rhaegar stood in the center of the valley, alone, his shadow blade in his hand, the void pulsing within him like a second heart. Around him, hidden in shadows and behind rocks and in the folds of reality itself, the entities waited. Valther to his left, Malachar to his right, the Sun Eater behind him, the Dreamer above. And beyond them, ringing the valley, the army of survivors stood ready, their weapons gleaming in the morning light. Rhaegar looked up at the sky and spoke. I am Rhaegar. I am the Scarlet Star. I have killed 5 of your brothers, a kingling in a forest, the king of hunters in his own realm, the king of war in your sacred gathering place, and now justice, mercy, and wisdom on this very ground. I have freed the Nameless from his prison. I have freed the Shadow Eater from his chain. I have freed the Sun Eater from the desert and the Dreamer from the ice. And I have an army of mortals who have seen your true faces and chosen to fight. He paused, letting his voice carry across the valley, across the mountains, across the world. I challenge you, all of you, come and face me. Come and prove that your power means something. Come and die like your brothers died, like you all will die if you don't stop me here and now. Silence. The sky remained blue, the clouds remained still. The world held its breath. Then slowly, the sky began to darken, not with clouds, with kings. They descended from the heavens in a blaze of light, their forms too bright to look at directly, their power pressing down on the valley like a physical weight. 12 of them, just as Alara had predicted, led by a figure of such immense presence that the very air seemed to bend around him. The king of creation. He was beautiful in the way that mountains were beautiful, terrible, ancient, indifferent. His face held the wisdom of eons, his eyes the cold light of distant stars. He looked at Rhaegar, and for a moment the void within him flickered. Mortal, creation spoke, and his voice was the sound of worlds being born. You have done what none have done before. You have killed my children. You have freed my prisoners. You have gathered an army against me. I should destroy you where you stand. Then why don't you? Because I want to understand. What drives you? What makes a single mortal believe he can challenge the divine order? Rhaegar met his gaze without flinching. You executed 20 years from now in a timeline that no longer exists. You let your priests frame me for treason and cut off my head. I did nothing wrong. I served you faithfully my entire life, and you let me die. Creation's expression didn't change. I let millions die every day. Mortals are born, they suffer, they die. It is the natural order. Then the natural order is wrong. Rhaegar raised his blade, and I'm here to change it. You cannot change the order of the universe. You are a mortal, a brief flame in an infinite darkness. When you die, the universe will not notice. Maybe, but I'll notice. And so will everyone I've saved. Creation studied him for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. Very well. If you want death so badly, I will give it to you. He raised his hand, and the world ended. Or so it seemed. Light exploded from creation's palm, a blast of pure creative energy that could have unmade mountains, evaporated oceans, shattered continents. It struck Rhaegar directly, and for one terrible moment, even the void within him screamed. But he didn't fall. The starfire ignited in his bones. The void wrapped around his soul, and he stood firm. The light washed over him, around him, through him, and he remained. Creation's eyes widened. Impossible. Nothing's impossible. Rhaegar took a step forward. I learned that from you. The battle began. Chapter 30. The Death of Creation. The entities erupted from their hiding places, engaging the lesser kings in a storm of shadow and fire and ancient power. Valther wrapped the king of secrets in darkness, consuming his hidden knowledge even as the king tried to flee. Malachor faced the queen of fate, her threads of destiny tangling in his shadow stuff as he tore through. The Sun-Eater burned through the king of harvest, his fire consuming the domain of growth and plenty. The dreamer simply watched, but his presence alone was enough to slow time, to make the kings hesitate, to give the others the openings they needed. Rhaegar focused on creation. They fought across the valley, through the mountains, into the sky itself. Creation's power was immense. He could shape reality with a thought, unmake anything that opposed him. But Rhaegar was no longer anything. He was void and starfire, death and rebirth, the assassin who had killed kings and the mortal who refused to stay dead. Blow after blow, he pressed forward. Creation's light dimmed with each strike, his form flickering as the void consumed him. But he was ancient, powerful, and he fought back with the fury of a king who had never known defeat. Why? Creation demanded as they clashed. Why do you fight? What do you hope to gain? Nothing, Rhaegar admitted. I don't hope to gain anything. I fight because it's right. I fight because someone has to. I fight because if I don't, who will? That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters. Rhaegar's blade found creation's heart. The king froze, his ancient eyes widening with something he had never felt before, genuine fear. You. I can. Rhaegar twisted the blade, and I am. Creation exploded into light. The remaining kings saw their father fall, and they broke. The king of secrets tried to flee, but Valther held him fast, consuming him slowly, savoring every moment. The queen of fate screamed as Malachor tore through her threads, unraveling her existence. The others scattered, pursued by the Sun-Eater's fire and the Dreamer's slow, inevitable attention. One by one they fell. By sunset, the valley was littered with divine corpses, their light fading, their power seeping into the earth. The entities feasted, growing stronger with each death. The survivors wept and cheered and held each other, unable to believe what they had witnessed. Rhaegar stood in the center of it all, his blade dripping with the essence of the king of creation. The void within him pulsed with satisfaction, but also with something else. A warning. It's not over, the deep dark whispered. The kings are dead, but their power remains. It will find new hosts, new vessels, new ways to manifest. The cycle will continue unless you stop it. How? Rhaegar asked silently. How do I stop it? You know how. You've always known. He did know. The void wanted him to consume the divine essence completely, to absorb it into himself and become something new. A king-eater, a star-devourer, a being that could end the cycle forever by becoming the cycle itself. But that path led to darkness, to becoming what he had fought against. There has to be another way. There is, but you won't like it. Tell me. Give the power back to the mortals. Let them decide their own fates, shape their own destinies, become their own kings. The divine essence will spread across the world, touching everyone, making everyone a little bit divine. There will be no pantheon, no hierarchy, no rulers, just people with power learning to use it. Rhaegar considered this. It was chaos. It was madness. It was exactly what the world needed. Do it. The deep dark sighed, a sound like the end of everything. As you wish. The void within him expanded, exploded, erupted outward. Divine essence flowed from the corpses of the kings, from the entities who had consumed them, from Rhaegar himself. It spread across the valley, across the mountains, across the world, touching every mortal, every living thing, filling them with power they had never imagined. The survivors gasped as they felt it, strength flowing into their limbs, clarity into their minds, fire into their souls. Timoth's cough vanished forever. Alara's blind eyes opened, seeing for the first time. Vance's brittle bones became unbreakable. Kael's divine light blazed brighter than ever, but now it was his own, not borrowed from absent kings. And Rhaegar felt himself fatting. The void had given everything to spread the divine essence. There was nothing left to sustain him. He fell to his knees, his vision dimming, his body growing cold. Kael was there instantly, catching him, holding him. No, no, you don't get to do this. Not after everything. It's okay, Rhaegar whispered. It's done. The kings are dead, the mortals are free, that's all I wanted. You wanted to live too. You wanted to see what comes next. Rhaegar smiled faintly. I've seen enough. I've seen people rise above their fears, their limitations, their pain. I've seen outcasts become heroes and princes become men. I've seen the impossible become possible. He coughed, and his blood was faintly golden. That's enough for anyone. The entities gathered around him. Valther, Malachor, the Sun-Eater, the Dreamer. They had consumed their fill of divine essence, but they had also given much of it back, following Rhaegar's example. They were diminished now, but also changed. Softer, more mortal. You were the best of us, Valther said quietly, and we will remember. Remember the mortals too. They're the ones who matter now. The Dreamer stepped forward, his ancient eyes soft with something that might have been grief. Sleep, child, sleep and dream. And when you wake, if you wake, you will find a world worth living in. Rhaegar's eyes closed. The last thing he heard was Kael's voice, broken with grief but strong with purpose. We'll make it worth it. We'll make sure they remember your name. We'll. But he didn't hear the rest. The darkness took him, gentle now, no longer hungry, and he slipped away into dreams. Epilogue, the legacy of the Scarlet Star. He woke to sunlight. Not the harsh light of the divine realm, not the cold light of the void, but warm, golden sunlight streaming through a window. He was in a bed, a real bed with soft sheets and a feather pillow. Birds sang outside. Somewhere nearby, children laughed. He sat up slowly, expecting pain. There was none. He looked at his hands. They were the same but different. No scars, no traces of the void, just human. The door opened and Kael walked in. He looked older now, his golden hair streaked with gray, his face lined with years and wisdom. But his eyes lit up when he saw Rhaegar awake. About time, he said, but his voice was thick with emotion. You've been asleep for 10 years. Rhaegar blinked. 10 years. 10 years, the Dreamer said you'd wake when you were ready. We weren't sure you ever would. Kael sat on the edge of the bed. A lot's changed. Tell me. So Kael did. He told him about the years after the battle, how the divine essence had transformed the world. Mortals had gained powers beyond imagining, some good, some bad, most just trying to figure out what to do with. New nations had risen, old ones fallen. There was chaos, yes, but also hope. For the first time in history, people controlled their own destiny. The entities had stayed, watching, guiding when asked, but never ruling. Valthar had become a guardian of shadows, protecting those who walked in darkness. Malachar taught the uses of power to those who sought it. The Sun Eater founded a school for those with fire in their souls. The Dreamer simply watched, as he always had, but now he shared his visions with those who needed guidance. Timoth had become a leader, organizing the survivors into a council that governed the valley and beyond. Ilara's visions guided their decision, though she always said the future was never certain. Vance led an order of scouts who explored the new world, mapping its wonders and dangers. And Kale had become something like a king, though he refused the title. He traveled constantly, mediating disputes, helping people learn to use their powers, ensuring that the freedom Rhaegar had bought didn't descend into chaos. They remember you, Kale finished. Stories, songs, statues. The Scarlet Star who killed the kings and for humanity. Some people worship you, though I keep telling them not to. You'd hate that. Rhaegar laughed weakly. I would. There's more. Kale's expression grew serious. The divine essence is settling. People are having children now, children born with power instead of gaining it later. They're calling them the king touched. Some are worried they'll become a new Pantheon. Will they? I don't know, that's why I'm glad you're awake. Kale met his eyes. The world needs you, not as a king, not as a savior, but as what you've always been. Someone who shows people that they can be more than they think. Rhaegar was silent for a long moment. Then slowly, he swung his legs out of bed and stood. His body felt strange, light, almost insubstantial, as if he were made of nothing but will and memory. But when he took a step, the floor held. When he looked at his reflection in the window, he saw himself, older, calmer, but unmistakably himself. Where do we start? Kale smiled. There's a village not far from here. They're having trouble with a young man who can control fire but not himself. He's burning things by accident, hurting people. They don't know what to do. A fire starter who can't control his power. Rhaegar nodded slowly. I think I can help with that. They walked out together into the sunlight, into a world that was broken and beautiful and full of possibility. The birds sang, the children laughed, and somewhere in the depths of the earth, the void that had once been the deep dark pulsed faintly, waiting, watching, content. The Scarlet Star had fallen, but the man who had worn it was just getting started. Final epilogue. 500 years later, the world without kings was not a peaceful place, at least not at first. The decades following Rhaegar's passing saw turmoil, conflict, and chaos as humanity struggled to adapt to its newfound freedom. Wars broke out between those who wanted to create new hierarchies and those who insisted on true equality. Cults formed around the memory of the Scarlet Star, despite his explicit wishes. Some tried to recreate the divine system, elevating themselves to kinghood through accumulated power. But slowly, gradually, something new emerged. The king-touched children grew into adults who had never known divine rule. They had been born free and they fought to stay that way. They formed councils instead of kingdoms, communities instead of empires. They shared power instead of hoarding it. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was better than what came before. Rhaegar lived to be very old, though the void's touch meant he aged slowly. He trained thousands of students, who went on to train thousands more. The art of power control spread across the world, becoming a discipline, a philosophy, a way of life. He watched civilizations rise and fall, watched friends come and go, watched the world transform in ways he could never have imagined. When he finally passed, at the age of 170, he was surrounded by students and friends and family, all of whom carried his teachings in their hearts. His last words were simple: be kind to each other. The world is hard enough without making it harder. Kale outlived him by centuries, the divine light within him granting him extended years. He wrote everything: the story of the kings and their fall, the story of Rhaegar and the entity, the story of the battle and its aftermath. His books were copied and distributed across the world, ensuring that the truth would never be lost. The entities endured as entities do. Valthar became a guardian of the night, watching over those who traveled in darkness. Malachar taught the philosophy of power to those who sought it. The Sun Eater eventually grew bored with peace and wandered into the void between stars, seeking new fires to consume. The dreamer simply watched, as he always had, his ancient eyes missing nothing. And 500 years after Rhaegar's passing, a young scholar named Lyra found his journal in the cottage in the mountain. She read his private thoughts, his regrets, his hopes for the future. And she understood, finally, what made him different from the kings he had killed. He was just a man who did terrible things for good reasons, a man who loved and lost and loved again, a man who tried his best. That was all any of us could do. The Scarlet Star had fallen, but his light still shone.